Chapter 4405. And he did not want to recall Mu Qingqing. Because once he really missed her, he would realize that there were some things in the past that he really could not go back to. Some people would never be there. He had been hypnotizing himself, deliberately not recalling the bits and pieces of the past. Until now, when he saw Gong Xiaoying and Yun Shishir hugging each other and reconciling, he realized that the father and daughter had finally recognized each other. If his mother was still around, she would be greatly relieved to see this scene. However, if his mother was still around, Yun Shishir would not have waited until now to reconcile with his father. Yun Shishir had never minded the hurt that Gong Xiaoying had caused her. She understood that no one could doubt Gong Xiaoying's feelings for her. However, she could not forgive him because this man had made her mother wait for a lifetime. Gong Xiaoying also never dared to recall. Just like that, more than 20 years passed. In these 20 years, women had appeared by his side, but gradually, he realized that he did not need women anymore. Some people's positions were really irreplaceable. Gong Jie could not stand it anymore. Affected by such an atmosphere, he looked a little lost. He silently turned around and walked down the stairs as if he had lost all his strength. On the way back to the room, Hua Jin and Gong Jie bumped into each other. "Hey Gong Jie." However, halfway through his words, Hua Jin paused and did not speak again. He was shocked to find that there was a clear tear stain on Gong Jie's face. No matter how hard Gong Jie tried to hold it in, he could not stop his sad tears. Gong Xiaoying had been waiting for Yun Shishir's forgiveness, but he did not have any expectations. Just like how Mu Qingqing did not have any expectations when she waited for him. However, more than 20 years later, Yun Shishir finally forgave Gong Xiaoying. Her forgiveness also seemed to mean that Mu Qingqing had forgiven Gong Xiaoying. He finally realized that his mother had finally met the man in her heart that she had been thinking about all this time. For so many years, he had always had a vague feeling. That was, his mother was clearly still by his side and had not gone far away. Sometimes in his dreams he could still clearly see his mother's voice and face. Perhaps he did not realize it in his heart, but he actually hated Gong Xiaoying. Now he should really let go of all this. What's wrong? Hua Jin was a little surprised by Gong Jie's soullessness and walked over. When Gong Jie saw him, he did not say a word as he gently clasped his hand on his shoulder. "Don't move, what are you doing? Let me lean." Gong Jie leaned his head weakly on Hua Jin's shoulder. His weight, almost all of his bodies was almost all. To be he chooses. At night, Gong Xiaoying was sleeping on the bed when he suddenly felt a little inexplicably uneasy. In a trance he was half awake and half asleep. Although his mind was very clear, his consciousness had already entered the dream. In the dream he clearly saw that he was standing in a very dilapidated neighborhood. This was a very backward residential area. Chapter 4406. Gong Xiaoying slowly walked around the neighborhood aimlessly. The sound of children playing could be heard from the neighborhood. It seemed to be noon. He could vaguely hear the sound of cooking through the open windows of some houses. Soon after, someone called the playful children home for lunch. Beneath his feet was a newly poured cement road. This road seemed to have been an ordinary mud road before, but after the city's construction, it was transformed into a cement road. However, it seemed to have been modified bit by bit. As a result, the road had a patch-like feel. Piece by piece it gave a very shabby feeling. Suddenly he walked to a residential area and stopped in his tracks. From his point of view he could see a courtyard. It was a small courtyard, but it was neatly maintained. Green grass, wisteria, and beautiful Chinese roses decorated the originally dilapidated courtyard. He could not help but be attracted by the courtyard. He slowly walked a few steps closer, but he was unexpectedly bumped into by a few naughty children. The group of children obviously did not notice him, a foreigner, and did not have time to greet him. They chased after him and ran away. "Xiao Jie, wait for me," a voice attracted his attention. He turned around and saw a delicate and pretty little girl running past him in a huff. In front of her, a little boy who was about her height was waiting for her. "Hurry up. You're running so fast. How can I keep up? You're running too slow. We just finished eating. Don't run so fast." Okay. Hand in hand the two boys ran off again. Gong Xiaoying's gaze was deeply attracted by the two children. He watched as they ran further and further away. Then he chased after them a few steps closer. "Run slower." He heard a woman worriedly calling out to them. The voice came from the window in front. He carefully went from the backyard to the front. For the residents of this neighborhood, the courtyard facing south was the main entrance and the back was the back door. There was an open window at the back door. A woman was sitting by the bed, holding her chin as she watched the two children run further and further away. Helpless, she sat down by the window. From his angle, he finally saw clearly, it was her. The person who had waited for him all his life, the person he had missed all his life. Ching. Gong Xiaoying felt his voice tremble. His voice was so low that the woman obviously did not notice him. Instead, she looked in another direction, not knowing what she was waiting for. Perhaps, others would never be able to understand what it felt like for her to just wait by the window. What was it like to use all your strength to wait for someone? Uneasiness, fear, lust, struggle, all kinds of emotions were mixed up. Gong Xiaoying could not help but mutter, Ching. He walked towards the window. It wasn't until he got closer and closer that the girl in the window inadvertently glanced over and caught sight of him. Her eyes were fiercely startled. She saw him. Gong Xiaoying stopped in his tracks and took a deep breath. He pursed his lips, but he could not hold back his tears any longer. After brewing in his throat for a while, he finally spat out a mouthful of turbid air. His eyes were red as he looked at her. His heart was filled with longing. "It's me," he spoke in a hoarse voice. The woman stood up abruptly and pushed open the window. Chapter 4407. They were not far apart, so he could see the expression on her face. Surprise, shock, panic. Mu Qingqing covered her mouth, but she did not have the same self-control as him. Tears kept rolling down her cheeks. Xiaoying? Perhaps Mu Qingqing didn't expect that she would be able to see him again in this lifetime. She hurriedly pushed open the door and walked towards him. However, when she got closer, she immediately stopped in her tracks and maintained a distance of 3 meters from him. She didn't dare to take a closer look. The two of them faced each other and there was a feeling of homesickness. She was afraid. When she got closer, she recognized him, but it was not him. He was also afraid. When he got closer to her and hugged her, it was all a dream. Mu Qingqing's eyes were already blurred by tears. Is it you?" she carefully confirmed. She was not sure if the man who suddenly appeared in front of her was the man she had been waiting for. Gong Xiaoying smiled helplessly. The corners of his lips curled up as his brows furrowed tightly. He took a deep breath and choked with sadness. "Qingqing, it's me. Xiaoying, is it really you?" Mu Qingqing tried to take a few steps closer to him. She looked at him carefully until she was sure that the man standing in front of her was the man she had been thinking about and waiting for. She could no longer suppress her emotions and completely broke down. "You're here. You're finally here?" She had waited for so long. Mu Qingqing sadly threw herself into his arms and asked hoarsely, "Why are you only here now? I've waited for so long, why are you only here now?" Mu Qingqing nestled in his arms. Her tears could not help but wet his lapel. Gong Xiaoying carefully hugged her, afraid that he would hurt her if he hugged her too tightly. Or perhaps he was afraid that this was just a long dream. If he hugged her too tightly, the person in his arms would turn into ashes when he woke up. Mu Qingqing hugged him tightly and he hugged her tightly as well. Even if it was just a simple hug, they had waited for more than 20 years. Mu Qingqing sadly said, "I thought I would never be able to wait for you again." She used the last of her strength to force the words out of her mouth. "I thought I would never see you again in this lifetime. How could that be? Idiot, aren't I here now?" Gong Xiaoying hugged her tightly. "Qingqing, don't be afraid. I'm here to take you home." Her whole life she had been drifting around helplessly with no one to depend on. Just like migratory birds, they would never have a harbor to rest in. Hearing his words, Mu Qingqing was overjoyed. "Really? Will we have a home?" "Yes. This family has me, you, little Jia and Shirshir." Gong Xiaoying looked at her and sobbed even harder. "Let's never be separated again, okay?" He held her face in his hands and scanned her features inch by inch. He desperately wanted to take a few more glances at her. She was still as beautiful as before. She had jet black hair and mesmerizing eyes. They were watery and lively as if they were carrying thousands of stars. She stared at him as if he was the only one in her eyes. How could she not want to take a few more glances at him? Gently holding his face, Mu Qingqing tiptoed and took the initiative to kiss his forehead. Xiaoying, I don't regret. She did not regret waiting for him for so long. Chapter 4408. Xiaoying, Mu Qingqing stood on her tiptoes and gently kissed his forehead, the tip of his nose and the edge of his lips. Finally, a soft kiss landed on his lips. Gong Xiaoying was immersed in the bliss of this kiss. He closed his eyes and his eyelashes trembled violently. Was this a dream? Vaguely, there seemed to be a voice that was asking him silently. Qingqing, am I dreaming? Dream? Mu Qingqing laughed. How could it be a dream? I'm still worried and scared. Is this a dream? Ching, Gong Xiaoying finally couldn't hold it in anymore. He buried his face in her neck and couldn't control his tears anymore. I miss you so much. These 4 words couldn't express how much he missed her. He seemed to recall the first time they met. She was beautiful and moving. She looked back and smiled, and he fell in love at first sight. When they were swimming in the lake, he hugged her and kissed her ear, telling her how much he loved her. She wasn't the only woman he had. However, there were many women who passed through his life, but she was the only one who left such a deep impression. I miss you so much. Gong Xiaoying's tears fell and burned her skin. He really missed her. Every time he woke up from a dream in the middle of the night, he felt as if he was suffocating when he thought that he would never be able to hold her in his arms again. He had also been young once, and he had also made a solemn vow of undying love with her. However, he made her wait for so long. In the end, she didn't see him. Xiaoying, I miss you too. Mu Qingqing held his face and gently kissed his lips. However, he gradually realized that there was an empty space in his arms. He opened his eyes and saw that Mu Qingqing's body was gradually becoming transparent. Qingqing? He suddenly panicked and reached out to grab her hand. However, the moment he reached out, his hand passed through her body. It was as if countless petals gathered together and were blown away by the wind. Mu Qingqing's gentle smile was gradually buried by the petals. Finally, it was blown away by the wind. Gong Xiaoying abruptly sat up on the bed. Only then did he realize that everything he had just seen was actually a dream. In his dream he saw her. It was as if he had returned to the place where she had been waiting for him. She was still standing guard there. However, the ending was different from reality. He had found her and she had waited for him. The regrets of this life seemed to have come to an end because of this. Was it really just a dream? Or perhaps she had never left. It was as if the two of them had fulfilled their long-cherished wish through this dream. Gong Xiaoying's eyes became a little blurred. He got out of bed and walked to the window. Outside the window, the horizon in the distance was gradually turning bright. He believed it. Mu Qingqing didn't leave. As long as his longing for her remained, this longing would bring him to the end of the other realm, to the place where she was. And she would rely on his longing for her to return to the dream and meet him again. Love would convey each other's beliefs to the other side. Please remember me. Although goodbye must be said. Please remember me. Tears don't fall though I must go far away from you. You live in my heart, and every night of separation I sing a song for you. Please remember me. Although I must go far away, please remember me. When I hear the sadness of the guitar, this is the only proof that I am with you until I hug you again. Chapter 4409. Gong Jie vaguely felt that someone was sitting by the window. He forced his eyes open and saw a familiar figure sitting by his bed. It was a woman. Gong Jie furrowed his brows as a hand seemed to be gently placed on his forehead. You're awake. What's wrong? Do you have a headache? Mu Qingqing's gentle voice rang in his ears. Was it his mother? Gong Jie suddenly felt a lump in his throat. He leaned over and subconsciously hugged her waist. Mom, slap, slap, slap. The hand that was originally on his forehead began to gently pat his face. A voice filled with disdain sounded in front of him. Wake up, wake up. Gong Jie finally woke up and opened his eyes wide. At this moment, a beam of sunlight shone in from the window. He realized that the sky had cleared up. The sun was high in the sky and it was shining brightly. Under the bright sunlight, he finally saw the person in front of him clearly. Hua Jin stared at him speechlessly. Gong Jie suddenly sat up from the bed and grabbed him by the collar. What are you doing? Hey, what are you doing? Why are you glaring at me so fiercely? Hua Jin looked aggrieved. I worked so hard to take care of you for the whole night. You? Take care of me? Gong Jie expressed his doubts. What about me? Hua Jin sized him up and asked tentatively, What do you mean? Have you forgotten what happened last night? What happened last night? Gong Jie frowned and looked at Hua Jin. He suddenly said something that almost made Hua Jin choke to death. Did we sleep together? Could it be that he mistook Hua Jin for a woman and something happened? Although he was drunk and did not recognize anyone, he had to admit that Hua Jin was indeed more beautiful than a woman. However, he was not the kind of man who would mess around after drinking. Hua Jin's face immediately turned red. Are you out of your mind? Gong Jie snorted, then tell me what happened last night. Yesterday you were drunk. I was afraid that you would vomit in the middle of the night, so I stayed by your bedside and didn't sleep the whole night. Vomit? I remember there was a man on the news who got drunk. He was so drunk that he vomited all over his body. However, because he didn't clean up the vomit in his mouth in time, it went back into his trachea and he eventually suffocated. If you died because you were drunk, wouldn't that be a pity? Gong Jie's expression turned even uglier. Could it be that in his heart he was that inferior? When Hua Jin saw his cold face, he was instantly annoyed. Hey, you really have no conscience. He stood up angrily. Just as he was about to turn around, Gong Jie took a deep breath and gently held his forehead. Because he drank a little wine last night, he had a hangover and had a bad headache. He furrowed his brows and said helplessly, "Sorry, I mistook you for my mother just now." Your mother? When Hua Jin heard this, he immediately turned around and sat by the bed. He asked curiously, "Is your mother called Mu Qingqing?" Last night when you were drunk you kept calling out Mom. Are you thinking of your mother? Shirshir and her father have also acknowledged each other. This is probably your mother's wish. Chapter 44:10. Gong Jie smiled all of a sudden. She's not dead. Not dead? Yes. Gong Jie turned around, opened the drawer and took out a photo frame. In the photo, a woman was sitting on a flower bed. It was a photo taken casually. There were not many photos of Mu Qingqing when she was alive. Gong Jie had put in a lot of effort, but many of Mu Qingqing's photos were lost one after another when they moved or when they were dealing with her funeral. This was his best preserved photo. Gong Jie looked at the photo with a gentle gaze that he had never seen before. She's always lived in my heart. He had never forgotten. He believed that death was not the main point of life. Forgetting was. The candle of life would not be extinguished easily. The connection between people was their memories. He had always remembered her and carefully kept her in his heart, never forgetting her. He also firmly believed that as long as her memories were still there, she would not disappear. He also believed that once a person lost their life, their soul would go to another world. Although that world did not have a warm body, it had everything that this world did not have. Hua Jin smiled when he heard that. I also believe that as long as your memories are still there, she will always live in your heart. Are you in a hurry to go back? Aren't you going to stay for a few more days? After staying on the island for a few days, Yun Shirshir mentioned that she wanted to go back home. On the tarmac, the private jet had been waiting for a long time. Gong Xiaoying, however, was reluctant to part with her. He repeatedly urged her to stay, hoping that she could stay on the island for a few more days. Dad, I didn't go back with Yaja because I wanted to bury the hatchet between us. Now that we've acknowledged each other, it's time for me to go back. However, Xiao Yichen and Yu will stay for a few more days. Hua Jin and Natalia will have to stay on the island for a while longer. Alice refused to let Natalia leave. She said that Yu needed a long period of observation after a few days, so she could not go back with Yun Shirshir immediately. Thus she could only return alone. Gong Xiaoying held his beloved daughter's hand, but he was reluctant to let go. He couldn't bear to let her go. Yun Shirshir smiled and said, "It's not like we'll never see each other again. Anyway, since you've handed over Hurricane's affairs to Xiao Jie, you can come to our place to stay for a few days when you're free." However, Gong Xiaoying had his own concerns. "Shirshir, do you think he will accept me?" Yun Shirshir was stunned. She knew that Gong Xiaoying was worried that Mu Yaja would not accept him. "Dad, do you still hate the Mu family?" Gong Xiaoying's gaze turned complicated. He sighed and said helplessly, "Hate is just a term used by incompetent people. Rather than hating the Mu family, I might as well hate myself more." However, he used to be so proud. How could he be willing to face his own mistakes? However, at that moment he had thought things through. It was impossible to say that he did not hate the Mu family. However, he did not hate Mu Yaja as much as before. "You and he are the two most important men in my life. Since I've decided to accept you and not hate you anymore, then he will naturally let me do as I wish. He won't hate you, so don't worry." Only then did Gong Xiaoying relax a little. "I'll tell him that I'm sorry the next time we meet. He had hurt you and Xiao Yichen." This was his apology to Mu Yaja. Chapter 44:11. Yun Shirshir was surprised that a man with such a high status like Gong Xiaoying would take the initiative to apologize to a junior like Mu Yaja. Gong Jie stepped forward and said to Gong Xiaoying, "Dad, it's getting late. Let sister go back early." Gong Xiaoying also nodded and watched Yun Shirshir board the plane. The group of people waited until the plane broke through the clouds and left the tarmac. Yun Shirshir returned to the country, leaving Hua Jin and the three little guys behind. Natalia's situation was not optimistic. Hua Jin was worried every day and night. Yu's condition was stabilizing, so Alice and Romanka focused more on Natalia. During the few days when Natalia was in the lab, Hua Jin and Gong Jie would accompany and protect her. Romanka and Alice discussed whether they should use Yu's treatment plan on Natalia and combine the two personalities into one. Alice was a little hesitant. Everyone's situation was different. Just like the same illness, the same treatment plan, but the results might be different for everyone. For example, taking medicine. Some people could use penicillin treatment without restraint, but some people were allergic to penicillin and could not use such medicine. Alice was worried about exactly what Romanka was worried about. He was also worried that Yu's treatment plan would not work on Natalia. Therefore, he proposed to bring Natalia back to his lab and work with other authoritative experts in this field to develop a treatment plan suitable for Alice. Alice agreed. When Alice wanted to take Natalia away, Hua Jin was naturally worried and wanted to go with them. He asked for Gong Jie's opinion and Gong Jie agreed. After packing their luggage and setting the flight route, Alice and Romanka boarded the plane together with Hua Jin and Natalia on a sunny day. Alice and Gong Jie agreed that they would contact him as soon as they arrived at their destination. However, a day and a night passed and Gong Jie did not receive a call from Alice. He sent a video call to Hua Jin, but there was no response for a long time. He thought that the group was too tired from the trip and went to bed early after arriving at their destination, so he did not pay much attention. However, on the second day and the third day, Gong Jie still did not receive a call from Alice. He could not sit still anymore and contacted the person in charge of Romanka's private lab. However, he was told that Romanka and Alice did not return to the lab. This time he could no longer keep his calm. Just like that, the group of 4 disappeared without a trace. He sent someone to investigate the flight that Alice and Romanka were on. After the investigation, his subordinate came back and told him that the flight had changed its route midway, but the flight route had been cut off. Generally speaking, the flight route would be reported back to the headquarters during the flight. However, the plane carrying the 4 of them lost contact halfway through the journey. Some of his subordinates speculated that the plane might have been hijacked by terrorists and lost contact with them. Gong Jie could no longer keep his calm. This plane was under his private name, and the body of the plane had a particularly eye-catching logo of the Hurricane Group. Usually, when he went out, what he was most afraid of was not the weather suddenly worsening, but the terrorists who were waiting for an opportunity. Chapter 44:12. The flight route from Darkwind Island to the research lab where Romanka was located was very long. They needed to stop midway before continuing their flight. The stopover was about 5 hours long. However, even if they stopped for 5 hours, they should have arrived at their destination long ago. Unless there was an accident. Some people analyzed and suspected that terrorists had already found out the flight route of the plane. Moreover, they might have hijacked the plane when it stopped midway. Hijacking? They did not rule out that possibility. However, who could have hijacked the plane? There were too many possibilities. Hurricane Group had many enemies, especially in the Nanzhou and Zhongdong regions. There were many organizations that hated Hurricane Group. Guessing based on this alone was undoubtedly like looking for a needle in a haystack. Gong Jie was a little annoyed. Choosing to let them take the Hurricane Group's private jet was probably his biggest mistake. If they had really been hijacked, Gong Jie was 100% sure that these people must have come for him. However, there were no results at the moment. Therefore, these could only be categorized as guesses and could not be confirmed. However, as the investigation deepened, they basically ruled out the possibility of a plane crash or an air accident. Yu and Xiao Yichen were on Darkwind Island. They originally planned to return to China in a few days. However, something happened to Hua Jin and Alice, so their plan to return to China was temporarily put on hold. Someone was targeting Hurricane Group. There was no news for a few days. The people sent to investigate always returned empty-handed. Even if they had really been hijacked, they should have stated their conditions. Even if they had encountered extreme terrorists and perished together, they should at least want to see the person if he was alive, and the corpse if he was dead. There was no news at all. There was really no news at all. If they did not explode in silence, they would perish in silence. For a few days, Gong Jie's mood was very low. He did not know whether Alice and the others were safe or not. However, Yu repeatedly comforted him that no news was the best news. However, Gong Jie did not think so. He had never been hijacked. There were countless terrorists eyeing him, but every time he went out, Hurricane would go up and down, eyeing him covetously. The mercenary group he sent out was enough to annihilate a medium-sized armed organization. No matter how many people had their eyes on him, it would be difficult for him to break through. However, there were many side branches of the Gong family who had encountered terrifying kidnappings. The hurricane grew stronger day by day. At the same time, walking on the edge was like walking on thin ice. Every step was frightening. He remembered that when Gong Jie was not yet 18 years old, he had heard of something. Ever since he was young, one of his older brothers who had always bullied him in the Gong family was kidnapped. Rumor had it that she was abducted by a group of anti-Japanese martial artists. Following that, she was placed under house arrest for 3 months. It was said that in order to prevent him from escaping, the martial artists directly cut off the tendons in his arms and legs. In the end, Hurricane paid a hefty price to redeem him, but when he came back he was no different from a cripple. A ransom of 50 million was just a small sum to Hurricane. The reason why he generously offered 50 million was to protect the dignity of the Hurricanes. In the end, these militants did not end up well. They dared to go against the Hurricanes, but in the end they suffered a double loss and were ruthlessly oppressed by the Hurricanes. However, the life of the person who was kidnapped was ruined. Chapter 44:13. Originally, a high-spirited young man, after experiencing an inhumane kidnapping, returned to Hurricane, but he was depressed. In the end, his wound became infected and worsened. In the end, he died young. After experiencing this incident, Gong Jie deeply understood that in this world, the strong preyed on the weak. It was easy to go up the mountain but difficult to go down. When a person finally reached the peak and stood there for a long time, as the saying goes, it is lonely at the top. Wanting to come down again is no longer a simple matter. As the son of Hurricane, from the moment he returned to the Gong family, he was destined to have an extraordinary life. At the same time, he also shouldered a responsibility that was 100 times more difficult than that of ordinary people. Once you entered this cruel world, it would be impossible for you to escape. Then he could only become stronger. Gong Jie had always been careful to protect the safety of his family. Every time he returned to China, he would be extremely careful whenever he met with Yun Shirshir. What he was afraid of was that those who were secretly watching him would shift their attention to Yun Shirshir. His sister was already married and had a family. She was no longer alone. In addition to her beloved husband, she also had 3 lovely children. He acted cautiously in everything he did, lest he bring her unexpected disaster. Hurricane was the world's arms factory. In addition to the heads of state, the government, anti-government militants, and extreme terrorists, there were all kinds of people who dealt with it. Dealing with killing must be accompanied by killing. Therefore, as the successor of the Hurricane Group, Gong Jie had long been used to the world of open and covert attacks. A moment ago, the president who signed an agreement with him and shook hands with him on friendly terms might go to the International Court of Justice to propose an express restriction on Hurricane in the next second. A moment ago, the terrorists who were baring their fangs and brandishing their claws at Hurricane and threatening to bomb the headquarters of Hurricane, the next second, they stood in front of him with a flattering face, groveling and raising their orders. In this world there were no eternal friends, only eternal interests. The world was bustling and I came for the interests. The world was bustling and I went for the interests. Gong Jie was worried that Hua Jin, Alice, and the others were probably targeted by the terrorists. This was still a relatively ideal suspicion. If they fell into the hands of the extremists, then, the consequences would be unimaginable. Could it be someone from the Temple of Light? Gong Xiaoying and Gong Jie were sitting in the study. Both of them were at a loss of what to do. In the midst of the silence, Gong Xiaoying suddenly raised a suspicion. Gong Jie's eyelids twitched when he heard this. The Sacred Palace sect was a small sect when it was first established. Later on it became a cult. It had been 20 years since its establishment. At first it was just an ordinary independent religious group, but after Jim came to power, it slowly began to change. Until now, the Temple of Light had more than 5,000 devout followers. One of the main beliefs of the Temple of Light was the so-called Doomsday belief. The program continued to promote that in the future, the whole world would face a catastrophe, and only those who joined his sect would be spared. The sacred church asserted that the signs of the end of the world were everywhere, such as the destruction of the ozone layer, the spread of AIDS, the outbreak of global racial conflicts, and so on. Only by joining the Temple of Light could one escape the calamity of the apocalypse, because the Temple of Light could provide the believers with the necessary supernatural abilities. Chapter 44:14. As the leader, Jim's main responsibility was to protect the believers and send them to the Holy Land, Sirius. In ancient Greek and Roman mythology, Sirius was the star where the gods gathered and had boundless magical power. Didn't the leader of the Sacred Hall, Jim, try to sign an order with you some time ago? Gong Xiaoying sized up Gong Jie and was puzzled. But you didn't satisfy him. The so-called Sacred Hall is actually a fake religion under the name of Christianity. It's an evil sect. Gong Jie furrowed his brows. Besides, guess what he said in the email? He wanted to sign an order worth tens of millions of USD to resist the restrictions of the International Federation. But he couldn't pay tens of millions of USD. What did he say in the email? He said he wanted to give me his son and daughter and his woman. Gong Jie said coldly. He said he was the son and daughter of the Holy Child and had boundless magical power. And his woman was only one of his many mistresses. He said he was the incarnation of God and she was God's woman. Gong Xiaoying heard and couldn't help but snort. I don't know if he's really crazy or just pretending to be crazy. Gong Xiaoying was a little suspicious. I heard that you humiliated him in your reply to his email. Gong Jie didn't say anything and just kept silent. How did you humiliate him? Gong Jie said. I forgot. In other words, you humiliated Jim. That's the truth. Yeah, then you angered him because of that. Gong Jie's face became gloomier. He didn't dare to imagine that it was really someone from the Sacred Hall. If it was true, then he couldn't sit still anymore. Gong Xiaoying said, I've already warned you. Stop people like the Sacred Hall if you can avoid them. Even if you're at a disadvantage, don't fight them head-on. They're barefooted and aren't afraid of anything. When they go crazy, they'll ignore everything. But I can't sign this order with him. Gong Jie didn't think he did anything wrong. If they get their hands on the arms worth tens of millions of dollars, who knows how crazy they will be. But you shouldn't have humiliated him like that. Gong Xiaoying went straight to the point again. You clearly know that there's something wrong with their brains. People like Jim would even think that he's a god and that his deal with you is a gift to you. If you reject him, you're going against God's will. He'll definitely teach you a lesson. Is the Sacred Hall sect so arrogant? Gong Xiaoying curled his lips coldly. What you know about the divine Sacred Hall is superficial. Do you know that the development of the Sacred Hall sect came from the remnants of the Sacred Hall sect? These were all brainless people. Those who were afraid of hurricanes were all clear-headed. However, why would these brainless people be afraid of hurricanes? Perhaps in their eyes, hurricane is just a vassal. The remnants of the Sacred Hall sect. The Sacred Hall sect is the evil cult that developed with the old Jinshan but was destroyed by the Federal Bureau of Investigation because of the bombing of the American International Federation's government building. Yeah, I see. Gong Jie narrowed his eyes. His thoughts gradually fell into a deadlock. If it was really done by the Sacred Hall sect, then he didn't dare to make a rash judgment. Chapter 44:15. Gong Xiaoying looked serious. If you can protect Alice, then protect her. After all, she is a senior member of Hurricane. Don't force her. Gong Jie's face turned even colder. He suddenly stood up, turned around and looked at Gong Xiaoying. Huajin, Alice, Natalia. Not one less. Gong Jie turned around and left the office. Kira, send me all the information about the sanctuary. Gong Jie ordered to investigate all the information about the sanctuary. Yu Yu's face turned pale when he heard that it might be the sanctuary that did it. He knew a lot about the sanctuary. Uncle, do you know about the dark web? Gong Jie was surprised that Yu Yu mentioned the dark web to him. I know a little. The dark web was something that very few people who lived in peaceful countries could come into contact with during peaceful times. However, the dark web was very famous. There was a rumor that an international student from an American university was kidnapped. It was said that the murderer had already noticed the victim from the beginning and was lurking around her. However, no one knew whether the victim was dead or alive, or where she was now. Some people guessed that the victim might have been moved to an unknown place by the murderer. She might have died, or she might have suffered a fate worse than death. Do you know how those videos on the dark web came to be? What are you trying to say? Yu Yu frowned and said with a serious expression, there are many videos on the dark web about mutilation, killing, and all kinds of inhumane renti experiments. They all came from the sanctuary. Actually, this matter is not known to outsiders. I only learned about this because I intercepted a private email from the sanctuary's leader. Hiss, the man could not help sucking in a breath of cold air. Then, Huajin, his first thought was Huajin's safety. Even Gong Jie did not realize that at such a critical moment, he was more concerned about Huajin's safety than about Natalia. Yu Yu said, if it's really the Temple of Light, then it'll be troublesome. However, I think that if it is really the Sacred Palace sect, they will not do anything to Huajin and the others. Perhaps they will use Huajin and the others as hostages to restrain Hurricane and fulfill some of their conditions. Their conditions should be the $50 million military order. The Jim Church can't take out that much money at all. They want to gain something without risking anything, so they came up with this idea. But I'm sure that regardless of whether you take out the $50 million order or not, Huajin and Alice won't survive. Even if you really take out $50 million worth of munitions, they won't let Huajin go. Gong Jie felt a chill in his heart. Chapter 44:16. Gong Jie felt a little helpless. Facing the cult, he had no idea what they would do. He said, "The sacred shrine is sinister and cunning. I didn't expect them to do this. But no matter what, if it's really the sacred shrine, then even if there's only a 1 in a million chance, I won't give up on anyone." Yu also agreed. Just as everyone was panicking, Hurricane suddenly received an email. There were a few photos attached to the email, and it was also a threatening letter. However, it also confirmed Gong Xiaoying's terrifying guess. An account with the name Divine Shrine Sect sent an email. There were a total of 5 photos. 4 of them were photos of Alice, Natalia, Huajin, and Romanka. They were tied to chairs with black hoods over their heads. Alice in particular was covered in wounds and bruises. Huajin, on the other hand, was in no better shape. Although Natalia was a child, she wasn't treated well because she was a child. She was also covered in wounds. There was another photo that Gong Jia was shocked when he saw it. In the photo, the 4 of them had their hoods removed and were kneeling on the ground. In front of them were the decapitated bodies of the crew members. It was a very intimidating photo. Glorious decapitation. The sacred shrine had done a lot of dirty things. Their usual method was to imitate extremist terrorist organizations and use decapitation to intimidate their followers. In the sacred shrine, the church set up free cafeterias, daycare centers, elderly clinics, and other social services. The followers of the sacred shrine were people who felt hopeless in life and couldn't get help from society. They were drug addicts, elderly, and lonely people. They were dissatisfied with the reality of society and felt that their future was bleak. They were terrified of nuclear war. Many of them were influenced by nihilism and thought that life was impermanent and that living was a kind of pain. Therefore, after they joined the church, they often talked about suicide. The leader of the sacred shrine even organized a mass suicide drill in Guyana. However, some followers were influenced by the ugly methods of the church, especially when they learned that leader Jim stole followers' property, faked miracles, severely punished followers, and called himself the new savior. Therefore, some followers wanted to leave the organization and secretly escape. Running away from the church was considered a betrayal. Anyone who betrayed the church, once discovered, would face a glorious execution. The divine palace believed that only with a complete body could one ascend to heaven after death. However, once a follower was beheaded, they would only have the fate of going to hell. The church would even behead these traitors in front of thousands of believers to serve as a warning to others and serve as a deterrent. This tactic was extremely intimidating, and the church had tried it many times. Gong Jia realized that all the crew members had been beheaded. It was obvious that Natalia was not in a good mental state. At such a young age, she had witnessed such a cruel scene with her own eyes. She must have suffered quite a shock. But looking at Alice and Huajin, it was clear that they were still calm. Only Romanka was on the verge of collapse. Alice had seen this kind of scene many times, and Huajin deeply understood that fear, uneasiness, and fear could not change one's fate. Instead, these emotions would only make one feel isolated and helpless. Comparatively speaking, it was better to remain calm. Chapter 44:17. However, Romanka was quite shocked and his mental state was not good. Sacred Shrine Sect. Yu looked at the photos attached to the email and slammed the screen. It's really the Sacred Shrine Sect. Gong Jia was annoyed and humiliated to the bone. These damned evil cults. This email was clearly a provocation to him. Other than the photos, the email also stated that if he wanted to redeem the 4 hostages, he would have to continue the unfinished agreement between the 2 parties. Just as Yu expected, this Jim was ambitious. He really wanted to get something for nothing. In the email, the church stated that they would give Hurricane half a month to prepare the contents of the order. Within half a month, if they did not prepare the contents of the order, they would immediately execute the 4 hostages. Jim was so smart that he was sure that among the 4 people he kidnapped, there must be someone Gong Jia cared about the most. Tens of millions of dollars was not worth mentioning to Hurricane. However, these hostages were worth far more than tens of millions of dollars. Gong Jia gritted his teeth in hatred. He knew that with his identity he would face such threats every day when he was not around. The Sacred Shrine Sect was the biggest tumor that Hurricane had to face. Hurricane had offended the Sacred Shrine Sect before. In the beginning, Gong Jia was not willing to sign the order with the Sacred Shrine Sect because the Sacred Shrine Sect was an anti-world and anti-human evil cult. If the Sacred Shrine Sect really got the order of tens of millions, it would be a disaster for the whole world. At that time, as Hurricane, they would be in a difficult position. Therefore, Gong Jia decisively refused and was prepared to fight against the Sacred Shrine Sect to the end. He thought that when the time came he would use the International Federation's anti-evil cult authority and the United Nations deployment to eradicate the Sacred Shrine sect. However, he did not expect the Sacred Shrine sect to make the first move. Gong Jie ordered, "Immediately forward this email to the International Federation. Send it secretly." He planned to use this to cooperate with the International Federation. Hurricane had always been against the International Federation. Gong Jie was even at the top of the International Federation's wanted list. However, as the saying went, there were no eternal friends and no eternal enemies. There were only eternal interests. In front of the Sacred Shrine sect, the International Federation naturally had a common enemy like the Sacred Shrine sect and temporarily cooperated with Hurricane. Although it was a temporary alliance, at least they had a higher chance of winning. At the same time, Gong Jie was prepared for the worst. He issued an order to start preparing the orders requested by the Sacred Hall. 2 nuclear weapons, 3 in 1, and countless military munitions and ammunition. At the same time, the International Federation quickly replied to Hurricane's email. They expressed that they were willing to cooperate with Hurricane to eradicate the Sacred Shrine sect. However, the International Federation asked Hurricane unconditionally. Of course, Gong Jie was unwilling. The International Federation's goal was to eliminate the Shrine sect at all costs and regardless of the consequences. At all costs. In other words, they would not hesitate to sacrifice Hua Jin and the other 3 hostages. However, Hurricane's goal was to protect Hua Jin, Alice, and the other 2 at all costs, regardless of the consequences. Was not important. Chapter 44:18. To get rid of this tumor, they had to wait until the 4 hostages were safe. The cooperation between Hurricane and the International Federation was to reduce the risk. After all, if this order fell into the hands of the Sacred Church, it would be a huge threat to the world. But the International Federation didn't trust Hurricane completely. Hurricane's most optimistic idea was to protect the 4 hostages and prevent the order from falling into the hands of the Sacred Church. Therefore, Hurricane requested the International Federation to cooperate with Hurricane. But the International Federation wasn't willing. They didn't trust Hurricane. In their eyes, Hurricane and the Sacred Church were equal threats. Why would the police be willing to stand on the same side as the world's #1 army and become allies? While the 2 sides were in a stalemate, an accident suddenly happened. Early in the morning, Gong Jie was called to the office by Gong Xiaoying. In the office, Gong Xiaoying pushed a laptop in front of Gong Jie with a gloomy expression. "This is a new document sent by the Sacred Church. Take a look." Looking at Gong Xiaoying's expression, Gong Jie suddenly realized that the situation wasn't good. He looked at the laptop that had turned off and then looked at Gong Xiaoying's gloomy expression. He suddenly realized that the Sacred Church had made a new move. He opened the laptop and stopped at the email. In the email there was a video file. He suddenly didn't dare to open it. What is this? Gong Jie looked at Gong Xiaoying with a trembling voice. Gong Xiaoying turned to look at him with a gloomy expression. "Take a look for yourself." Gong Jie didn't dare to open it. Gong Xiaoying sighed deeply. "I'm guessing that there are spies sent by the Sacred Church to the International Federation. Or maybe some of the internal members were bribed. It's also possible that the Sacred Church has a top hacker who intercepted the email sent to you by the International Federation. They know that Hurricane and the International Federation are working together and are probably angry." Gong Jie's body stiffened. He roughly understood what the content of the video was. "Shao Jie, bang." Gong Jie slammed his fist on the table. His face was extremely gloomy. Along with the heavy punches, a few cracks appeared on the glass-paved table. Gong Xiaoying didn't mince his words. The Church of the Sacred Shrine already knows that the Hurricane Force has reached an agreement with the International Federation. In my opinion, we might as well terminate the cooperation with the International Federation. Otherwise, if this continues, the hostages' lives will be in danger. Gong Jie took a deep breath and finally decided to watch the video first. After weighing the pros and cons in his heart, he finally opened the video. As soon as the video was played, a hostage was tied up in a dark room, unable to see the sun. In the dim light, Gong Jie could vaguely make out that the man in a balaclava sitting on the chair was none other than Romanka. His head was hanging to the side. He was obviously drugged and was unconscious at this moment. Then a dark-skinned, weirdly dressed man walked behind Romanka with a butcher's knife. Gong Jie's heart almost jumped out of his throat. His hand that was holding the mouse trembled uncontrollably. Chapter 44:19. As the video progressed, Gong Jie saw the man violently remove the hood on Romanka's head and splash a basin of salt water on him. The salt water corroded the wounds on Romanka's body. He suddenly woke up and screamed hysterically in pain. His screams were hoarse and terrifying. Through the computer, his voice of despair could be heard. "No, I beg you don't." Romanka, who had always been calm, finally showed the uneasiness of facing death. The man made him face the camera. When Romanka looked at the camera, his desire to live was almost undisguised. "I beg you don't kill me." The man grabbed his hair and ordered him, "Do you still remember what I taught you?" Romanka swallowed hard and quickly nodded. I remember. Speak." "Long live the sacred palace. Long live the sacred palace." Romanka shouted pathetically and humbly at the camera. "Long live the sacred palace. Long live the sacred palace." The next second the man smiled viciously. The murderous aura on his face was almost unconcealed through the screen. He raised the knife and pointed the sharp side at Romanka's throat. Then he slashed back and forth. Gong Jie slammed the laptop shut. He couldn't bear to watch anymore. Gong Xiaoying smoked a cigarette. His gaze was complicated. "Is he dead?" Gong Jie didn't finish watching the video and asked him for confirmation. Gong Xiaoying was silent for a while. Then he slowly said, "He was beheaded. The sacred palace's methods are ruthless. This time they sent us a video to promote their martial arts and try to intimidate us." Gong Jie shuddered at the thought once more. It wasn't the first time he saw the horror of beheading. However, this was definitely the most uneasy he had ever felt. Because this time, the ones in the sacred palace's hands were Hua Jin, Alice, and Natalia. He was afraid that if he angered the sacred palace again, the next one might be Alice. Or maybe he was protecting Natalia. Perhaps it was Hua Jin. When Gong Jie thought of Hua Jin sitting on the chair and being honorably beheaded, he felt a chill run down his spine. Now he couldn't care less about being surprised. Why did Hua Jin's life and death actually make him so nervous? "Father, what should I do now?" Gong Jie, who had always been decisive, was at a loss for the first time. It wasn't that he couldn't think of a way, but that he didn't dare to make a rash decision. He was suddenly afraid of taking risks. Because the risk he was facing this time was not something he could bear no matter what. "I said, no matter what, terminate the cooperation with the International Federation. You know that the organization that the Sacred Palace sect hates the most is the International Federation. For them, the International Federation is their biggest enemy. If you cooperate with the International Federation, you will be provoking the Sacred Palace sect." Gong Jie was stunned for a moment. He held his forehead in annoyance and his 5 fingers went into his hair. His face was pale. "Okay, I will immediately terminate the cooperation with the International Federation. Then what's next? Are you willing to take the risk?" Gong Xiaoying looked at him deeply. Gong Jie looked at him. After a moment of silence, he said firmly, "I am willing." Chapter 44:20. In the conference room. The cold incandescent lights were on. Gong Jie's back was facing the crowd as he leaned back in his chair. He was deep in thought as he looked at the information about the divine sacred temple displayed on the big screen. Behind him, the crowd was discussing anxiously. "What should we do? Alice is still in the hands of those evil cultists. The divine sacred temple. I'm afraid it's going to be a disaster this time. It's said that the divine sacred temple's base is in East Africa. It's a war-torn zone. Not to mention rescuing the hostage, it's not easy to just go in and leave calmly. Is young Master Jie really going to rescue her personally? A mercenary team of 5,000 people? It's not much different from a local battle. If so many people rush in at once, it'll create a huge commotion and be disadvantageous to the situation. Those evil cultists have a lot of eyes. If they know that Hurricane has sent so many people, they'll definitely fly into a rage and kill the hostage directly." Gong Jie swept a cold glance over them. "Are you done talking?" Everyone was instantly scared into silence. Gong Jie turned around and glanced expressionlessly at his subordinates sitting around the long table. He suddenly stood up and placed his arms on the table, his expression serious. "I've decided. Vermilion Bird." The blonde woman immediately stood up. "Yes." Gong Jie ordered, "You take 50 elite subordinates and escort the goods to East Africa with me." 50 people? Vermilion Bird raised her eyebrows but was a little worried. "Young Master Jie, is 50 people really enough?" "It's enough. If there are too many people, it'll be difficult to control them." Although Gong Xiaoying had sent him a mercenary team of 5,000 people, it was just as some people had feared. If so many people went together, it would be too big of a commotion and alert the enemy. On the other hand, an elite team of 50 people would be easy to command and wouldn't attract attention. Vermilion Bird also understood Gong Jie's meaning. After confirming it, she nodded. After the meeting ends, I'll mobilize them immediately. Jed. Yes. Go and prepare the goods on the order immediately. Hearing this, Jed didn't wait for Gong Jie to finish his instructions before asking worriedly, Young Master Jie, are we really going to do as they say? Since when did Hurricane allow these small fries to lead him by the nose? Prepare the goods according to the Sacred Hall's requirements. Those things can trigger a war at any time. Gong Jie frowned. Have I finished? Jed lowered his head guiltily. Nuclear missiles, intercontinental missiles, air defense missiles. None of them are equipped with a missile head. A firearm without a missile was no different from a cell phone without a motherboard or a pistol without bullets. Jed immediately understood. Understood, I'll go prepare it right away. Vermilion Bird asked, When are we leaving? Wait for my orders. Gong Jie raised his wrist and looked at his watch. It was about time for the people from the Sacred Hall to reply. Last night, after leaving Gong Xiaoying's study, Gong Jie learned that someone from the Sacred Shrine had sent him another email, urging Gong Jie to prepare the goods as soon as possible. Gong Jie proposed a condition for the exchange. Before escorting the goods, Gong Jie had to confirm the safety of the hostages. However, as he expected, the people from the Sacred Hall were very cautious about this and rejected it immediately. Chapter 44:21. His attitude was firm. He claimed that the most important hostage to him had already been beheaded, and the remaining 3 hostages were dispensable. If they couldn't even confirm the safety of the hostages with a simple video call, then there was no need to talk about this deal. They could do whatever they wanted with the hostages. Gong Jie said this to weaken the confidence of the Sacred Palace sect. They had originally thought that Alice and Natalia would be the 2 most important hostages to Hurricane, while Romanka and Hua Jin would be on their list of targets to be executed. They originally planned to execute Romanka first as a show of strength. If Hurricane didn't cooperate, then they would execute Hua Jin to force Hurricane to submit. Gong Jie said this to make the Sacred Palace sect think that the 3 hostages weren't that important to Hurricane. This would weaken the Sacred Palace sect's confidence. Of course, Gong Jie also knew that the Sacred Palace sect wouldn't believe him so easily. But Hurricane also issued a warning. Once Jim gave the order to execute the hostages, then it would be the end of the Sacred Palace sect. At that time, Hurricane would use all its power to completely destroy the Sacred Palace sect. In fact, it would be easy for Hurricane to deal with the Sacred Palace sect. On this point, Jim knew what he was doing. However, Gong Jie's words were undoubtedly a threat. Although Jim had doubts about what Gong Jie said, and the 3 hostages were also doubtful about the importance of Hurricane. However, at least Hurricane was willing to sit down and negotiate with the Sacred Palace sect. This proved that the remaining 3 hostages were still valuable to Hurricane. However, Gong Jie's impatient attitude made Jim feel a little guilty. Soon, the Sacred Palace sect sent an email to confirm the video call at 8 o'clock in the evening. 8 o'clock in the evening. The Sacred Palace sect connected to Hurricane and sent a video call on time. Gong Jie accepted the video call. Soon, the blurry image of a person sitting on a chair appeared. Gradually, with the adjustment of the video, the image became clearer and clearer. The silhouette of Hua Jin's figure was reflected in his eyes. Hua Jin was tied up and sitting on a chair. Even though his head was covered with a black cloth bag, Gong Jie still recognized him at a glance. Based on the outline of his body, he could basically confirm that this hostage was Hua Jin himself. However, he seemed to be unconscious now. Hua Jin's head drooped to one side. His entire body was limp. He didn't seem to be sitting at all. Instead, he seemed to be tied to a chair. Gong Jie had a bad premonition. He gripped the table tightly but forced himself to calm down. What's wrong with him? He was afraid that something would happen to Hua Jin, but he was even more afraid that this was a trap set by the Sacred Hall. Perhaps they were testing him to see how worried he was about this hostage. Once Gong Jie showed any signs of nervousness, Hua Jin, as an important hostage, would become a bargaining chip for them. Therefore, Gong Jie didn't show any nervousness on his face. He deliberately kept his emotions calm. Why isn't he moving? Gong Jie questioned in fluent English. Through the screen, a masked evil cult member faced the camera and suddenly took out a knife from his back. Chapter 44:22. When Gong Jie saw this, the muscles on his face tightened. Could it be? Damn it. Was this person going to behead Hua Jin? Stop. Gong Jie was about to stop him, but he saw the person holding the knife and using the handle to hit Hua Jin's head. Ugh. With a muffled sound, Hua Jin's body trembled slightly, and he finally reacted. Don't worry, he's still alive. The evil sect member snorted disdainfully, obviously mocking Gong Jie for making a fuss over nothing. Gong Jie clenched his fists and said, "Take off the hood on his head." "What? I think your goal is to confirm whether the hostage is still alive. The rest is unnecessary." Gong Jie asked, "If I don't take off the hood, how am I supposed to confirm that the hostage is still alive, and not just any random person?" "Oh, voice can't be imitated. In fact, voice is very easy to imitate. Let me repeat, I want to confirm the safety of the hostage." The evil sect member was suddenly annoyed. He raised the chopper in his hand and waved it in front of the screen, showing off his power. "Don't play any tricks and don't ask for so many harsh conditions. We've already shown you the video to confirm that he's not dead. What else do you want? Our leader is talking to you about this business with 100% sincerity. What right do you have to doubt us?" Gong Jie said calmly, "Since you're 100% sincere but you still beheaded a hostage. Is this sincerity? Sorry, I can't see any sincerity from you. You, take off the hood." Gong Jie's eyes turned cold. "This is my last concession. Otherwise we'll talk about the deal face to face." The evil sect member was so angry that he paced back and forth a few steps. However, in front of Hurricane they did not dare to be too arrogant. Gong Jie's attitude made them uneasy. They were really worried that Hurricane would be indifferent to the three hostages. No matter what kind of kidnappers, they were most afraid of kidnapping hostages that had no value in negotiation. Therefore they did not dare to be too presumptuous. "Okay, this is also our last concession." The heretic walked to Hua Jin's side and tore off the black cloth bag in one swift motion. Hua Jin's weak and pale face was immediately reflected in his eyes through the screen. Gong Jie looked at Hua Jin and for some reason he felt an inexplicable palpitation in his heart. It was obvious that the evil sect members were not polite to him. A round of beating was unavoidable. There were some slight bruises on his face and some bloodstains on his neck. He didn't know how he got them. He was very weak now. So hungry. Water? 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 One could vaguely see that his lips were extremely dry and cracked. Other than that, his voice was very low, as if he had not eaten for days. Gong Jie was a little angry. It seems like they haven't eaten for a long time. The evil sect member did not think so. He won't die if he doesn't eat for a few days. But he said he's hungry and wants to drink water. You haven't given him water for a few days? That's none of your business. The evil sect member snorted. Anyway, we just need to make sure he's still alive. We don't care about the rest. Chapter 44-23. Gong Jie was getting more and more furious. Hua Jin, a man, was already in such a state. It was hard to imagine how Alice and Natalia, a weak woman and a young child, had been tortured by them. They probably didn't even give them a sip of clean water. Give him water. I'm warning you too. Don't ask for too much. Too much? This request was too much. Gong Jie was infuriated. If he could transmigrate, he would definitely rush past the screen and strangle this heretic. He said angrily, "Treat these three hostages well. It won't do you any harm." Boom. Through the video feed, one could vaguely feel the earth quaking and mountains shaking. The place where Hua Jin was had seemed to have been bombed by artillery in the war-torn zone. The heretic said coldly, "You've seen it too. There's a war going on here all the time and there's a shortage of food." Gong Jie couldn't say another word. He turned his head and signaled with his eyes. His subordinates were also very smart. They immediately understood and began to investigate the location of the video. "Gong Jie, is that you?" Hua Jin seemed to have regained some of his consciousness. In his daze he muttered a few words. Gong Jie immediately replied, "It's me." The two of them communicated in Mandarin. The heretic obviously didn't understand Mandarin. Worried that Hua Jin would use Mandarin to send a message to Gong Jie that would be unfavorable to them, he immediately chopped him with his hand. Hua Jin let out a muffled groan, but he resisted the urge to scream. Gong Jie said, "Don't worry. Wait for me. I'll make sure that you'll be safe." Okay, Hua Jin didn't dare to say anything more. It wasn't that he submitted to the people from the sanctuary, but he was worried that Gong Jie would be too worried. "That's it. Hurry up and prepare the things we need and set a time and place. We can't wait that long." With that, the video signal was cut off. Gong Jie slammed his fist on the table and gritted his teeth in anger. "Young Master Jie, we've located their location." "Where?" "The coordinates have been generated, but they are in a neutral zone between two war zones. Although they are not in the war zone, they are in the middle. No wonder the people of the Temple of Light wanted a large number of armaments." He sucked in a deep breath of cold air. "All right, we'll leave tomorrow morning," Gong Jie ordered. Vermilion Bird worriedly walked over and looked at Gong Jia. Do you have to go personally? This time it bodes ill rather than well. Why don't you leave it to me? We will definitely bring the three of them back safely. Vermilion Bird was a mercenary, and as a mercenary they had always lived through life and death. To them there were only benefits and they were not afraid of death. But Gong Jia was different. They did not trust Gong Jia to go to such a place personally. It was simply risking his life. I'm worried if you guys go. Why? Vermilion Bird was a little puzzled. Young Master Jia, forgive us for being blunt. Hurricanes can accept losing a subordinate like Alice, but they can't accept that you're in danger. In their eyes, no matter how many Alices were, they couldn't compare to Gong Jia. What's more, Hua Jin and Natalia, two insignificant people, were involved. Vermilion Bird was especially cold-blooded, but she was absolutely loyal to her employer. In her eyes, these three hostages were worthless, but she was unwilling to let Gong Jia take the risk. Chapter 44-24. He turned around abruptly, his handsome eyes sweeping across her as he questioned, Am I your master? Yes. Then as a subordinate, why are you questioning your master's orders? This sentence left the Vermilion Bird speechless. In her mind, Gong Jia was the king and she was the subject. Therefore she had to obey Gong Jia's orders unconditionally. But Zhu Ke wanted to say something, but Gong Jia glanced at her. Zhu Ke lowered her head guiltily. I understand. East Africa. In the confinement room, every corner was covered with cobwebs. Rats ran rampant and mosquitoes and flies flew everywhere. There was not even a vent here. There was no daylight and dust filled the air. It was extremely turbid. The small space was filled with the smell of blood. The door suddenly opened. Hua Jin was pushed in. His feet were chained. He staggered and fell face down on the ground. Alice was nervous. She was in a semi-conscious state. Because she had only eaten a small amount of rice and water for a few days, she was a little muddle-headed. Hua Jin's muffled groan woke her up. However, she did not dare to say a word, not even a word of concern. Her eyes were covered by a blindfold, so she could not see anything. She could only hear Hua Jin groaning in pain. Shut up. Keep quiet. The son of bitch. One of the cultists kicked Hua Jin a few times before leaving, cursing and swearing. The door of the confinement room slammed shut again. Alice did not dare to say a word. She looked up. In her memory just 2 days ago she and Hua Jin exchanged a few words in Chinese. Through the 24-hour surveillance camera, a group of evil sect members immediately rushed in and punched and kicked them. She did not dare to speak to Hua Jin again. Originally, Alice thought that no one would dare to do anything to them because they were backed by Hurricane. Until she saw Romanka being beheaded and his throat slit with her own eyes. She completely realized that this group of evil cultists were inhumane. They were not afraid of the Hurricane at all. In order to save her life, Alice swallowed her anger and didn't dare to speak out again. Hua Jin, on the other hand, had never suffered like this before. Even though the filming environment was extremely harsh, it was not even 1/10,000th of this place. Not to mention, it was a fear that could not be hidden. He didn't even know what these crazy cultists would do in the next second. Every minute of his life was extremely precious to him. He didn't even know if he would live to see the sun rise tomorrow. In fact, the cultists did give them some food and water to eat. In fact, whether it was Alice, Hua Jin or Natalia, they were all very important to them. After all, the hostages were their bargaining chips in the negotiations with the Hurricanes. Before the negotiations were successful, they naturally hoped that the hostages would live well. But the rice and water given to them every day was pitifully little. They were originally in a war-torn zone. When the war broke out, Jim also wanted to migrate, but they were caught between the anti-government armed forces and the Orthodox army, so they could not move an inch. So they requested to negotiate with the Hurricanes. Because of the war, the clean rice and water they had was already very precious. Therefore, the food given to the hostages was naturally even less. Chapter 44-25. Hua Jin came back after being beaten up. As soon as the cultists left, he struggled to kneel on the ground and vomited a mouthful of blood. He raised his head and struggled to move in the direction of Alice based on his vague memory. His hands and feet were chained. In order to prevent him from escaping, his eyes were also covered with a black cloth. He moved to Alice's feet and leaned against the wall with his back against her. Alice stretched out her palm. Then Hua Jin stretched out his finger and struggled to write on her palm stroke by stroke. Alice had a hard time trying to decipher the words with the help of his hand gestures. Hua Jin wrote a few sentences. Just now, Gong Jia had a video call with them to confirm whether we are still alive. It seems that he is ready to take action. Alice, don't give up. We will definitely live well. Alice took a deep breath and seemed to feel that the wounds on her face were gradually not painful. She stretched out her blood-stained finger and wrote on Hua Jin's palm. I will persevere. You must persevere too. Okay. We will definitely wait until Gong Jie comes to save us. Okay. The two of them struggled to rely on their hands and write on their palms, passing the message to each other. Natalia also woke up slowly. She opened her eyes and looked at the ceiling deck. The corners were full of cobwebs. Her stomach was growling with hunger, but she knew that it was not time for dinner yet. No matter how hungry she was, it would not help. Are we going to die? Natalia grumbled, feeling wronged. In fact, she was not afraid of death. Since she was kidnapped here, Hua Jin and Alice took care of her a lot. At least she was spared from a lot of beatings. Under the protection of Hua Jin and Alice, she did not suffer much except for not being able to eat enough, sleep well, and wear warm clothes. However, it was because of this that Natalia was extremely distressed. Although she was still young, she knew very well how much Hua Jin and Alice had suffered for her. Because of frustration and guilt, she could not hold on any longer. If she could, she would rather bear the pain for Hua Jin and Alice. It was time to deliver food. Hua Jin and Alice had already figured out that there were guards around the confinement room. However, this group of guards was usually on duty for 12 hours. Moreover, after 12 hours they would be replaced. However, Hua Jin and Alice's judgment of time had been completely blurred after being in the dark for many years. Just now, Hua Jin's had to head from the confinement room to another room, because he had no idea what time it was. But he vaguely guessed that it should be time for the shift. At the same time, this also meant that this was the 4th day since they arrived. The 4th day, Hua Jin let out a silent sigh. Hua Jin, Alice lowered her voice and called him in a voice that was almost inaudible. Hua Jin turned his head and met her eyes. The window was nailed with wooden boards, but the morning light outside the window shone in through the gaps. With the weak light, Hua Jin saw that Alice's eyes were filled with worry. Do you feel scared? After all, it was not the first time Alice had encountered something like this. But for Hua Jin, it was the first time in his life that he had been kidnapped. Scared? Of course I'm scared. Chapter 44:26. Hua Jin was also a layman. He was not a saint, so he did not care about death. He was also afraid of death. He was even more afraid of such an inhumane death. When he closed his eyes, Romanka's tragic death still appeared in front of his eyes. Just thinking about that miserable scene made him want to vomit, as if there were countless things in his stomach churning. He was stunned and swallowed the things that had originally surged up his throat. He did not eat much to begin with. If he vomited some more, his body would not be able to hold on for much longer. Natalia finally could not take it anymore. She suddenly said, "Don't give me food anymore, okay?" Alice and Hua Jin looked at her in surprise. Natalia said, "I know that you have always wanted to protect me. Moreover, although you don't say it and always hide it, I have always known that you have secretly given me your food. Actually, there is no need. I don't need to eat so much. If you eat so little, you will definitely collapse." Natalia, Alice smiled and said, "We are fine. Don't worry, I don't want to live alone." Natalia finally cried out in despair. After coming here for so long, she had been so strong that she had not shed a single tear. However, when she woke up and saw Hua Jin covered in injuries again, and thought about how Hua Jin had been beaten up in order to protect her, she could not take it anymore. Her emotions broke down and she completely broke down. "I want to live with you. If anything happens to you, I won't be able to live either." Natalia clenched her fists tightly and was so sad that she cried. "Don't give me food anymore. I can hold on. Let's live together, okay?" Hua Jin looked at Alice and was extremely touched by Natalia's words. Gratified. Natalia was actually so gentle. In such a desperate situation, not every child could be so calm, indifferent to life and death, and even think about others. "Don't worry," Alice said, "we will definitely be able to wait until Gong Jie comes to save us." Yes. At the mention of Gong Jie, Natalia's eyes lit up with hope. "He will definitely come and save us. We can't just give up like this. Don't be so dejected." "Yes." Reporting young Master Jie. "Everything has been prepared. When do we set off?" "Young Master Jie, the 50 elites are all in position. I have also prepared all the supplies needed for the journey. We are just waiting for your orders." The harbor. A huge armed cargo ship was quietly docked at the coast. There were still people moving things back and forth onto the cargo ship. This cargo ship was carrying munitions worth tens of millions of dollars. Gong Xiaoying looked at the harbor, still in disbelief. He turned to look at Gong Jie and asked tentatively, "Are you really not going to consider adding more members? 50 people? You are facing the Divine Temple sect, which has thousands of followers." Gong Jie smiled. "Like you said, it's 5,000 believers, not 5,000 soldiers. 50 people are more than enough to deal with 5,000 disciples. Of course, I don't think those 5,000 followers are that scary." Chapter 44:27. Gong Jie glanced at Gong Xiaoying expressionlessly and said casually, "You're wrong. They're allies." Gong Xiaoying was shocked, but he quickly calmed down. He knew that his son's ability to remain calm in the face of danger was what he was most proud of. No matter how dangerous the situation was, he could always turn it into a safe one. "My son never disappoints me." Gong Xiaoying patted his shoulder lightly. "However, in a place like East Africa, it's best to be careful." At this time, Gong Jie was already fully armed. He was wearing a handsome combat uniform and a military-style windbreaker. However, his silver hair was dyed black. Gong Xiaoying then realized that Gong Jie had unknowingly become a high-spirited man. At 1.9 meters tall, he was much taller than him. He did not know if it was because he had grown taller or because he was getting older. Gradually, he was no longer young and his height was slowly shrinking. "Do you think that when people get older, their height will also become shorter?" Gong Xiaoying wanted to ease the tense atmosphere before departure, so he changed the topic. He asked half jokingly and half seriously. Gong Jie glanced at him coldly. "Don't make such a lame joke." Alright, I'll stop joking." Gong Xiaoying pursed his lips and suddenly went forward to give him a big hug. Even Gong Jie was taken aback by this. Since they were young, Gong Xiaoying had always been reserved and not good at expressing his concern for him. This was the first time that Gong Xiaoying, as a father, had taken the initiative to hug him. His hug made his expression a little unnatural. Gong Jie awkwardly turned his head and cleared his throat. "What's the matter? It's just a farewell. It's not like I won't be coming back. I'm just afraid that something will happen to you and I won't be able to see you again," Gong Xiaoying said sourly. After saying that, he even pretended to wipe his tears. Gong Jie looked at him coldly. "You seem to be hoping that I don't come back? Since when? Then why do I feel like you're cursing your son? As a father, of course I hope that my son will be well. How can I hope that my son won't come back?" Gong Jie was speechless. Gong Xiaoying said, "Alright, let's set off early. I'll wait for you." Gong Jie nodded and gave Gong Xiaoying a hug. Then he turned around and boarded the armed cargo ship. Before Zhu Ke boarded the cargo ship, she nodded at Gong Xiaoying. Gong Xiaoying called out to her. "Vermilion bird." "Yes. I'll leave little Jie's safety in your hands." Gong Xiaoying, taking the initiative to talk to her, made Vermilion Bird feel very honored. She immediately lowered her head and said firmly, "I will do my best, even if it costs me my life, to bring young Master Jie back safely." It was a 12-hour flight from Dark Wind Island, through the Strait of Malacca, across the Atlantic Ocean and from East Africa. However, this was already the shortest and fastest journey. There was a port in East Africa that was still well protected. However, because of the war, several airports in East Africa had been severely damaged, and all flights to other parts of the world had been suspended. The airports were in a state of stagnation and were completely paralyzed. Many countries were evacuating their nationals through the only port, Sofia Port. Chapter 44:28. Hurricane also had troops stationed in East Africa. At that time, when the ship docked at the port, the troops stationed in East Africa would come to pick them up. The voyage at sea was extremely boring, and they had to deal with the harsh sailing environment. On the day of departure, they encountered a storm. At night, the sea breeze was very strong and the waves hit the cargo ship. Even the experienced Gong Jie could not sleep well at night. When he slept on the bed, he felt dizzy as if he was lying on the top of the waves. He wanted to vomit, but because he did not eat anything, he could not vomit at all. All communication relied on the satellite phone. On the ship, they could not eat anything too greasy. Other than nutritious cans, pure water, and all kinds of fruits, meat was basically eliminated. Gong Jie could not sleep, so he came to the deck early, chewing on a nutrition bar, and looked at the sunrise on the horizon with a calm expression. "Did you not sleep at all last night?" Zhu Ke's voice came from behind. Gong Jie turned around and glanced at her. "Why are you not asleep?" "It's my turn to be on duty tonight." Zhu Ke strode over. "Immediately. I'm going to rest for a while. If I don't rest well, how can I deal with the next battle?" As a mercenary, Zhu Ke had a very powerful ability. That was, no matter when, where, what happened, whether sitting, lying, kneeling, or lying down, as long as she closed her eyes and wanted to sleep, she could quickly fall asleep in 10 seconds without being affected by the environment. This was not considered powerful. What was really powerful was that even when she was asleep, she could control when she woke up. She remembered that once, when she was carrying out an operation in the wild, she was lying on the battlefield, surrounded by corpses. The place where she lay was full of stinking blood. But when she closed her eyes, she quickly fell asleep. The rain of bullets and cannon fire did not wake her up. Under the cover of the trenches, she slept very peacefully. At night, the war subsided and she had enough sleep. When she woke up, she snuck into the enemy's base with her own strength and killed the exhausted enemy one by one. Zhu Ke was absolutely an outstanding mercenary. For her, as long as the target was chosen by her employer, to her, killing was no different from stepping on an ant. Sometimes, Gong Jie was envious of her good quality of sleep. Gong Jie bit on the nutrition bar and suddenly asked curiously, "How did you do it?" "What? Sleeping when you want to." This is also a kind of ability. Sometimes Gong Jie would have insomnia. Sometimes he would dream of many people. Mu Qingqing Yun Shishir. Those messy people made up a messy dream. So much so that no matter how long he slept, he still felt groggy. The vermilion bird smiled and walked over. She leaned against the railing and enjoyed the sea breeze. She calmly said, "Because besides killing people, I have nothing to worry about." She didn't have any burdens or concerns. He had no family, no lover. To her, she was all alone in the world and did not need to worry about anything. At the same time, feelings were a huge taboo for her. Whenever she touched it, it would become a burden to her. Therefore, even though he was almost 27 years old, he was still alone. "Won't you feel lonely?" Gong Jie smiled. "Your life is made up of smelly things. Money, blood. Would such a person really not feel lonely?" Chapter 44:29. Vermilion Bird disagreed. "I've been alone since I was born and I'll be alone until I die." She came alone and she left alone. Not a sound was heard. Gong Jie looked at her quietly and suddenly said, "Being a mercenary is not a long-term plan, and it's not a lifelong business. People will eventually grow old. When you're old, you won't have the strength to hold a gun or fight anymore. What will you do?" "Retire." Vermilion Bird said, "I've already thought about it. When I'm 35, I'll retire. I'll buy a high-end condominium in the busiest part of Los Angeles and raise a Doberman. That's the most comfortable life I can imagine." "You've never thought about marriage?" "Marriage?" Vermilion Bird heard this and laughed. "Marriage is so scary. This word is a disaster for me." Vermilion Bird smiled. "I won't get married. Not in this lifetime. What a lonely life." Gong Jie commented mercilessly. "What about you?" Vermilion Bird laughed coldly. "Aren't you lonely? Young Master Jie, you're almost 30. When are you going to get married and have children?" "Get married?" Gong Jie silently swallowed all the energy bars. He smirked as he chewed. "You don't seem to be interested in women," Vermilion Bird said as she inched closer to him. "Logically speaking, when a man stands in front of me, his breathing rate will quicken, his face temperature will rise, and his breathing will become hurried. But you don't seem to be moved?" Vermilion Bird was a very beautiful woman. She had a head of natural blonde hair, a fair face, and deep eyes that could capture one's soul. No matter what man stood in front of her, they would feel helpless. Gong Jie looked at her expressionlessly and suddenly said something that could choke her to death. "Oh, you're a woman. Why can't I tell?" Vermilion Bird resisted the urge to vomit blood. Gritting her teeth, she asked, "How can you not tell that I'm a woman?" Short hair, cold temperament, a pair of eyes staring at others like a leopard, the murderous intent in his eyes is very strong. Gong Jie raised his eyebrows and said, "Sorry, I can't imagine you as a woman." Vermilion Bird lowered her head and looked at herself. Combat uniform, bulletproof vest, knee-high combat boots, a defensive master sword and 2 desert eagles were fastened to her waist. It seemed that the murderous aura was indeed very heavy. "Are you sure you're not bragging?" Gong Jie teased. "If any man is interested in you, he's the one with the wrong orientation." The Vermilion Bird was left speechless. She flicked her fringe and said coldly, "Forget it. We're talking the same language." With that, she turned around and continued her patrol. Gong Jie couldn't help but laugh. It seemed that his poisonous tongue had hurt her. Gong Jie turned around and leaned against the railing, recalling Zhu Ke's words. "You don't seem to be interested in women." Gong Jie didn't notice it before. But it was true. It wasn't that women had never appeared around him. But he didn't seem to be interested in women of all shapes and sizes. But he wasn't interested in men either. Chapter 44:30. In the afternoon of the next day, the cargo ship had arrived at its destination. The ship gradually approached the port. Gong Jie left a few dozen men on the ship to guard the armaments. He brought Vermilion Bird and a few elites down the ship. Gong Jie and his men were in disguise. They wore a robe and a hat, but as soon as they got off the ship, he vaguely sensed that there were countless pairs of eyes staring at him and sizing him up. He didn't know if these people were from the sacred shrine. They probably already knew that the Hurricane Group's cargo ship would be docked at the port at this time, so they sent people to check the situation. The cargo ship was docked at the port, but Gong Jie wasn't worried about them hijacking the ship. Even the international armed forces were wary of the Hurricane Group's cargo ship. The cargo ship had so much space. When the Hurricane Group modified the ship, they didn't want to waste any space. Even the smallest space was stuffed with an interceptor missile. Even the crazy cult members wouldn't have the courage to get close to the cargo ship. They wouldn't dare to rob the cargo ship unless they were tired of living. However, the news of the arrival of the Hurricane Group's munitions would definitely be sent back to the sacred shrine. Gong Jie didn't show any abnormalities. He pretended to be a passerby. Soon, he felt that the eyes that were sizing him up quickly dispersed. The ship was far away from the port. At the same time, the Hurricane Group's troops stationed in East Africa sent a car to pick them up. Gong Jie and Vermilion Bird got into the car and closed the door. "Young Master Jie." The driver greeted him in a low voice. Gong Jie said, "Cut the crap and drive." "Okay." The Hurricane Group was stationed in East Africa and set up a headquarters. Most of the Hurricane Group's markets were in the North American and African markets. In the North American market, the bulk of the orders were from the Mexican government. As for the African market, East Africa wasn't a free market. However, it was a transportation stronghold that led to South Africa. To go to South Africa, one had to pass through East Africa. Hence, the Hurricane Group had already set up an absolutely mature freight route in East Africa. At the same time, in order to dispatch goods, Hurricane set up a command center in East Africa and stationed many relay stations. Most of the munitions relied on airplanes and waterways. Goods were transported to the target port by waterways, then unloaded from the port and transported to the target by container trucks. These stations were used to resupply these trains. In addition to the necessary gasoline, there were also food and military supplies. At the same time, these stations were also responsible for collecting intelligence and relaying intelligence. Before they left, Gong Jie had sent the coordinates of Hua Jin's location to these relay stations in Morse code. The relay station was responsible for collecting information and accurately locating Hua Jin's location. Gong Jie's idea was very simple. Simply and crudely, he would charge into the headquarters of the Holy Church, then control all the cultists and rescue the 3 hostages. After that, the fate of the Sacred Hall would be handed over to the International Federation. Since he had already offended the Sacred Hall, Hurricane would not tolerate the existence of such a malignant tumor. However, the intelligence gathered by several relay stations made Gong Jie realize that this matter wasn't so simple. "I think the Sacred Hall has already transferred the hostages separately." Transferred separately? Chapter 44:31. The subordinate reported to him, "The 3 hostages have been transferred to different places." In other words, Gong Jie followed his words, once one of the hostages is rescued, the Sacred Hall will get the news and the other 2 will lose their lives. "Yes." Gong Jie frowned and tapped his fingers on the table. He hesitated. Red Sparrow said, "Is it difficult? Locate the 3 hostages and rescue them in batches. We brought 50 elites and divided them into 3 teams to infiltrate the Sacred Hall's secret hideout and catch them all in one fell swoop." Gong Jie agreed with Red Sparrow's suggestion. The Vermilion Bird had a wealth of experience, so she had an excellent reaction time to deal with such situations. However, the subordinate sighed and revealed a worried expression. "Officer Red Sparrow, it's not that we haven't thought of your idea. However, after being stationed in East Africa for so long, we've dealt with the Sacred Hall many times. They're definitely not as simple as you think. You may not be familiar with their behavior, but we're very familiar with it. Living in East Africa, what the civilians are most afraid of is not the government army or the anti-government army, but the Sacred Hall and the Gita-man terrorist organization. Their methods are extremely cruel and inhumane. It's not something we can imagine. I think that once the Sacred Hall's people know that the Hurricane's cargo ship is docked, they'll tie a special device to the hostages to prevent the Hurricane's mercenaries from rescuing the hostages." Gong Jie's expression turned solemn at once. What special device? There'll be an explosive device on the handcuffs of the hostages. These devices are connected to a network. In other words, the handcuffs of the 3 hostages are connected. Once one of the handcuffs breaks or the lock is unlocked, the handcuffs of the other 2 hostages will explode. At that time, the other 2 hostages will be blown into a pile of flesh and blood. We have a few subordinates who were taken hostage by the Sacred Hall. We tried to rescue them, but the handcuffs were unlocked and the other 3 hostages were blown into a pile of flesh and blood. Even though it was a plain narration, one could still imagine how frightening that scene was. Red Sparrow listened but didn't say anything. She was already used to such scenes. A mother-child linkage device? Red Sparrow immediately thought of the name of the device. I remember seeing this device when I was on a mission. In fact, it's not a high-tech method. It's a very simple principle. The 3 handcuffs have an explosive point and a linkage device. If one of the devices is opened, then the other 2 devices will automatically switch to the explosive point and cause an explosion. How do we solve it? Gong Jie suggested, if you're not in a hurry to remove the handcuffs, why don't we rescue the 3 hostages first and find a way to access the device after we return to Hurricane City? Hearing this, the vermilion bird fell into silence. She turned around, crossed her arms and said solemnly, so far, I've never seen this kind of explosive device that can be neutralized. What do you mean? Chapter 44:32. In other words, once these handcuffs are put on, they can't be unlocked. In other words, once the Sacred Hall sect handcuffs them, no matter if it's us or them, we won't be able to unlock the device. Gong Jie was furious. In other words, from the beginning, the Sacred Hall sect wanted to kill them? You can say that. The Sacred Hall sect never thought of letting the hostages leave alive. Gong Jie frowned. It seemed that this matter was much more difficult than he had imagined. Then what about this? Red Sparrow said. First, unlock the handcuffs and bring Hurricane back. There are so many people in Hurricane, can't they figure out a way to unlock it? When the time comes, as long as they figure out a way to unlock the handcuffs, it won't be too late to unlock them. In short, the most important thing is to get the hostages out of here safely. That's true, but... Red Sparrow was finally impatient. But what? Do you think that such a big hurricane can't even unlock a simple linkage device? No. The man was obviously in awe of Red Sparrow. He said in a trembling voice, when the linkage device is activated, it will start a countdown. This kind of linkage device has a time limit. Usually it lasts for 7 days. If the handcuffs are not unlocked after 7 days, the linkage device will automatically explode, so... Red Sparrow was completely stunned. She was also shocked by the cruelty and viciousness of the Sacred Hall sect. However, she had seen such things many times, so she was not surprised. Gong Jie's face was extremely gloomy. He had already guessed that the Sacred Hall sect was so arrogant and their way of doing things was quite extreme. When it came to dealing with hostages, they were inhumane. They didn't care about the hostages' lives. They only used them as bargaining chips. And they were so arrogant because of the value of these hostages. However, even if they knew that their rescue operation might be classified as useless, they would still try their best to save the hostages. Red Sparrow was also confused. I don't understand. They are so extreme. Aren't they afraid that we will give up on the hostages? At that time, Hurricane will target the Sacred Hall sect and launch a crazy revenge. Are they really not afraid of Hurricane? Evil sect. Who are the cults? Gong Jie said, the cults believe in God, but these fake Christians believe that God has been silently protecting them. They think that after they die they can become gods and become immortal. Do you think they have any sense of reason? Since they are so loyal to God, why did they ask Hurricane to provide so many munitions? Because Bishop Jim is a pretty smart, sober man. He was taking advantage of the sincerity of the cultists to amass a huge fortune. Over the years, how many families had the Sacred Hall embezzled? Jim knew the truth of the world very well, but he used such nonsense to brainwash his followers and seize their property. Those believers are all poor people who have been deceived by him. A pitiful person must have a hateful side. No matter what, we have to rescue the 3 hostages first. Chapter 44:33. Yeah, I'll negotiate with Jim when the time comes. You're going to do it yourself? Vermilion Bird was a little worried. Young Master Jia, I think it's better if you don't do it yourself. Jim is a sly old fox. Who knows what kind of trap he has set for you? What a bunch of good-for-nothings. Who are those people around him? I heard that Jim spent a lot of money to hire a team of 100 mercenaries from Europe. However, these mercenaries have varying strengths and aren't a threat to me at all. Vermilion Bird was still a little worried. That's true, but in any case don't underestimate the enemy. Don't worry. I know what I'm doing. Vermilion Bird and Gong Jia went their separate ways. To rescue the hostages, they didn't need to bring a large number of people. 3 groups of 5 were enough. The rest of the people were to follow Gong Jia around the clock and be on standby. Gong Jia released the news that they had arrived at the port with the goods and were waiting for Jim's reply. At night, Jim quickly set a time and place. San Jose Sports Center. San Jose Sports Center used to be the largest training ground in East Africa. It used to be the venue for military drills and reviews. It was also the venue for international sports events. Ironically, the training ground that used to impart the spirit of peace was now surrounded by constant crossfire, and many civilians were killed or injured. The 5 rings that symbolized peace were still hanging at the top of the training ground. Gong Jia brought his men to the sports center. The sky gradually darkened. They had agreed on a time, but Jim still didn't show up even after a long time had passed. Perhaps his men had already arrived, but seeing that Gong Jia had brought his men here, he secretly investigated the situation. He was obviously worried that Gong Jia had brought a few thousand men with him. Jim, this old fox, was still rather afraid of death. Gong Jia turned around and said to the team of mercenaries responsible for his safety, "Go somewhere else. Don't stand here." "But, young Master Jia," Officer Vermilion Bird said. "Officer Vermilion Bird isn't here now. Besides, I'm the chief commander. You just have to listen to my orders." "But, didn't you arrange for snipers?" Gong Jia lowered his voice and asked, "Are the snipers on standby?" "It's on standby. I'm worried that Jim's side has also sent a sniper." "Where is the scout?" "Have him patrol the surroundings. Once he finds a sniper, kill him on the spot." "Yes, I understand." Gong Jia had arranged snipers around the training ground in advance. If Jim's side tried to harm him, they would kill him in advance. At the same time, the mercenaries would cover his safe escape. However, this was just in case. As expected, Jim did not dare to touch him. The mercenaries looked at each other and chose to listen to Gong Jia's orders, retreating to different places. It was just as Gong Jia had expected. Before long, Jim appeared with his men. Gong Jia sneered. This Jim was indeed a cunning old fox. He had been here for a long time, but when he saw such a big lineup, he felt afraid and didn't show up. A man walked over from afar, followed by a few strong bodyguards. Although they were dressed simply, Gong Jia knew that these were mercenaries disguised as evil sect members who were responsible for Jim's safety. Jim was dressed in a gray suit and leather shoes. He had a head of black hair and a deep outline. He was a typical white European. Chapter 44:34. "You are the chief commander of Hurricane, Gong Jia?" Jim came up and greeted him. Gong Jia was too lazy to talk nonsense with him. "Where are the hostages?" "Don't be in such a hurry." Jim laughed. "I've already made arrangements for the 3 hostages. When it's done, I'll return the 3 hostages to you." "Would they really be returned unscathed?" Jim didn't mention it. He only said that he would return the hostages. Who knew if he would return the hostages alive or 3 corpses? Gong Jia expressed his doubts. He raised his wrist and looked at the time. He said coldly, 3/4 of an hour later than the agreed time. "Is this your so-called sincerity?" "Sorry, I can't see it." Even though Jim had 3 hostages in his hands, Gong Jia's aura was still biting cold and his posture was extremely domineering. He knew in his heart that with Jim's personality, the more he tried to please him and the more subservient he was, the more unscrupulous he would become. Forceful words would instead make him soften his attitude slightly. Gong Jia was very good at reading people. When a person stood in front of him, he didn't need to talk. He could tell the person's personality just by looking at the expression between their eyebrows and the small details. When Jim heard this, he wasn't angry. Instead, he said humorously, "You know, there's fighting everywhere now. It's already not easy for me to come to the agreement alive." Gong Jia asked again, "Where are the hostages?" Jim was silent for a while. He looked at Gong Jia warily. Although he was alone, he had already sent people to check before he came. A group of mercenaries had escorted him here. This meant that these mercenaries were hiding in a hidden corner. If they did anything to him, then the mercenaries hiding in the dark would shoot him dead at any time. Gong Jia's tough attitude was the perfect proof. "I'll give you the goods at the same time." Jim had no intention of backing down. "I have to see the goods, verify them and count them. Only then will this deal be valid." After a pause he said, "However, I can't let Hurricane's people come here for nothing. I can't take so many goods for nothing. You see." He gave him a look. One of his men immediately brought up an iron suitcase and placed it in front of Gong Jia. If Zhu Ke was by Gong Jie's side at this time, she would definitely be on high alert. This was because no one knew what was inside the iron suitcase. However, Gong Jie did not expect that there would be any dangerous devices in the box. It would do Jim no good to kill him. Jim's goal was very clear. It was the order worth tens of millions of dollars. Gong Jie's life meant nothing to him. Don't worry, there aren't any explosives inside. Jim explained, inside there's some diamond raw materials. After it's done, I'll also give you a few hundred kilograms of heroin as a reward. Haley Quinn? Gong Jie did not accept the offer immediately. Instead, he rejected it coldly. Hai Luoyin is of no use to me. Hurricane never does business like this. Looks like Hurricane looks down on the drug business. Jim disagreed. But what's the use of drugs and munitions? They're all life-threatening things. Hurricane doesn't have to think so highly of themselves. I'll say it again. Chapter 44:35. Jim was extremely displeased with Gong Jie's haughty attitude, and his expression was already a little ugly. In fact, Gong Jie was stalling for time. Now, Vermilion Bird had infiltrated the cult in disguise to rescue the hostages. Given Jim's character, he would definitely send the most capable mercenaries to his side. As for the useless soldiers and crab generals left behind in the cult, Vermilion Bird did not care about them at all. Vermilion Bird had very strong anti-reconnaissance and investigative abilities. She would definitely be able to lead her men to rescue the hostages as soon as possible. But before that, Gong Jie had to stall for time as much as possible. If necessary, he would not hesitate to tie Jim up as a hostage. Let's go and inspect the goods first. Gong Jie sneered. It's useless to talk to you. With that, he stood still and waited for Jim's response. Naturally, he would not turn around immediately and leave his back to them. Jim could tell that Gong Jie was also very wary of him. He raised his eyebrows and suddenly asked, among the 3 hostages, there's a man who looks very attractive. When he said that, Gong Jie immediately realized that he was talking about Hua Jin and immediately became nervous. Him? What's wrong? You're so nervous. Jim immediately smiled evilly. Don't tell me that this man has a special meaning to you. Gong Jie's facial muscles immediately stiffened. Don't tell me that this man is your favorite pet? This sentence undoubtedly angered Gong Jie. Favorite pet. This wasn't a nice way to address him. From what he knew, Jim liked women, but he also liked men. As long as it was attractive, he was very interested in it. To him, whether it was a man or a woman, they were just for his amusement. In other words, men and women were like dogs. They were pets, not humans. Obviously, he said this because he regarded Hua Jin as a pet in his eyes. There was no difference. He treated Hua Jin as Gong Jie's plaything, but such blasphemy made Gong Jie unhappy. He swore that when Hua Jin, Alice and Natalia returned safe and sound, Hurricane would wash the headquarters of the Temple of Light with blood. What was there to be embarrassed about? It's not a rare thing for a man to like another man. Jim said, men and women are the same, they are all living creatures. In this world, there are only differences between gods, devils, humans, and ghosts. However, I am different from you. I am a god. Therefore, to be able to receive my gift is a great favor. If young Master Gong is interested, I have some pets for you to choose from. If you don't mind, you can pick a few pets and bring them back. It's not impossible. It's also a gift from me to Hurricane. Gift favor? What a disgusting metaphor. Gong Jie's face was full of disgust, but he didn't show it. He said indifferently, it's getting late. I think you should also want to check the goods as soon as possible and then finish this business. Everyone's time is precious. Don't waste it on these boring things. Haha, okay. Are the goods at the port? The port. It doesn't seem safe to trade at the port. Jim was also thinking. Why don't we transport the goods here? It was too risky to haul the goods back from the port. Chapter 44:36. Impossible. Gong Jie rejected him directly. He had no intention of handing these goods over to Jim. Doing this was just a delaying tactic. He was stalling for time so that Vermilion Bird would have more chances to rescue the hostages. Jim narrowed his eyes, secretly sizing up Gong Jie, and bluntly expressed his worries. If I follow you to the port, I don't know if you have any troops stationed there. When I reach the port, if I am ambushed by your men, wouldn't it be a waste? I won't take the risk like this. Gong Jie smirked. If I have any thoughts about you, I can get rid of you right here. How can you guarantee that? Gong Jie smiled coldly and then he snapped his fingers lightly. The next second, the mercenary standing closest to Jim was shot in the head by a sniper in the distance. The whistling bullet instantly penetrated the mercenary's head, and the warm blood splashed on Jim's body. The corner of his mouth that had not yet cooled down was stained with a trace of blood at the same time. Jim suddenly froze. Gong Jie raised his eyebrows. Is this enough to prove it? The mercenaries beside Jim reacted quickly, and almost at the same time they pointed their guns at Gong Jie. Gong Jie had both hands in his trouser pockets, and in the face of the other party's hostile aura, he appeared indifferent. He did not think that Jim would dare to let these mercenaries shoot. And the more calm Gong Jie was, the more restless Jim became. He waved his hand and roared, "Damn it! Put down your guns. Do you want to kill me?" If they fired at Gong Jie before Gong Jie fell, he would have been shot dead by the sniper in the distance. Jim was scared to death. Gong Jie glanced at him disdainfully. "Do you really think that I came here for the 3 hostages? Jim, if you don't even have the attitude to personally inspect the goods at the port, not to mention you, even these mercenaries beside you won't be able to live for long." His tone was unyielding. However, being tough also required the ability to be tough. Jim knew very well that Gong Jie had the right to be tough. However, he was also certain that Gong Jie would not kill him so easily. He already knew this before he rushed over. This time, what awaited him was not a deal, but a game between the two sides. Jim also vaguely realized that perhaps the Gong Jie was stalling for time. At this moment, he might have already sent out troops to search for the 3 hostages. However, he was also very sure that the lives of the 3 hostages were in his hands. This was also the last bargaining chip in his hand. "Gong Jie, I can go with you to the port, but I'm warning you, you better not play any tricks. Otherwise, if anything happens to me, those 3 hostages will definitely not be alive." Gong Jie had sent out Vermilion Bird. Even if he managed to find the hostages, he had to break through the encirclement of the heretics. If he managed to kill his way out, then Gong Jie would become a wanted criminal by the peacekeeping forces. Although they were members of an evil sect, they did not have the right to be shot to death. Gong Jie's expression was very ugly. He only prayed in his heart that Vermilion Bird could find the 3 hostages as soon as possible. Lead the way to the port. Jim took a step back. Chapter 44:37. Vermilion Bird's voice could be heard clearly through Gong Jie's earpiece. "Young Master Jie, we found Natalia." Gong Jie secretly heaved a sigh of relief when he heard that. However, he didn't show it and he didn't dare to let his guard down. When they arrived at the harbor, the cargo ship immediately brought down a ladder. Gong Jie turned around and said to Jim, "The ship is full of firearms. For safety reasons, all of you should unload your guns and board the ship." "Unload our guns." Jim finally couldn't take it anymore. "Hey Gong Jie, you can't be thinking of kidnapping us as hostages, right?" Gong Jie narrowed his eyes and said coldly, "The ship is full of my men. There are also Hurricane's assault troops stationed at the harbor. Even if you don't unload your guns, you won't be able to resist once you're here." After a pause, he smirked coldly. "Oh, I seem to have forgotten. From the moment you angered Hurricane, the Sacred Hall sect was already at the end of their rope." Jim's face was slightly embarrassed. The muscles on his face twitched slightly. Thus, he turned around and waved his hand lightly. The dozens of mercenaries looked at each other, somewhat unwilling. They were mercenaries who risked their lives. They couldn't go against their employer's orders. But, if they had to gamble their lives for a few $100,000 and it was a meaningless gamble, they were unwilling. In their eyes, their lives were more important than benefits. The most outstanding and most useless mercenary organization in the world was Mercenary Paradise, which belonged to Hurricane Group. The mercenaries who came from Mercenary Paradise were all veterans who had fought in various battlefields all over the world. Some of them were even young mercenaries who had undergone high-intensity training since they were young. They were loyal to Hurricane and wouldn't hesitate to risk their lives for it. Hurricane's benefits were far more important than their lives. Not every mercenary was willing to risk their lives for their employer, especially when it was obvious that it was dangerous. As mercenaries, they couldn't unload their guns in front of their enemies. Unloading their guns was like a tiger that had lost its claws and teeth, becoming a weak beast. "Sorry, employer, we can't unload our guns." The mercenaries took a step back. In the night, everyone's face was filled with resistance. Jim looked around and said fiercely, "I've paid you guys. You have to protect me. There's a clause in the agreement. If it's an unnecessary risk, we can refuse to carry it out." Jim was fuming. At that moment, he had become a trapped beast in Hurricane's hands. He turned around and looked at Hurricane with a pale face. For some reason, he suddenly sneered and raised his hands. "Instead of letting my mercenaries unload their guns, why don't you just tie me up? How about that?" "What?" The man was a little surprised. "I don't think Hurricane came here with any sincerity at all." This matter? Sect leader? Upon hearing this, Gong Jie realized that things were developing in an unpredictable direction. Sneering, Jim casually picked up the satellite phone and dialed a number. With a look from Gong Jie, one of the mercenaries behind him immediately rushed out and pinned Jim to the ground. In the blink of an eye, he had him pinned to the ground with his hands behind his back. However, the call had already been made. Chapter 44:38. The three hostages were in danger. Before Gong Jie could react, the mercenaries behind him pushed him to the ground and shielded him with their bodies. On the other side, Jim's mercenaries also raised their guns. Tut tut tut, tot-a-tot. The sound of rifle fire was heard and sparks flew everywhere. The sound of bullets piercing through bodies could be heard from time to time. Gong Jie let out a muffled groan as he felt a bullet in his back. In the midst of the sparks, the close-range battle lasted for a minute. In just a short minute, the mercenaries on Jim's side were completely annihilated by Gong Jie's mercenaries. In the blink of an eye, the port was covered in a river of blood. They couldn't even withstand a single blow. Gong Jie stood up and heaved a sigh of relief. Taking off his bulletproof vest, he pulled out a bullet shell from his back and smashed it on the ground. Because of the bulletproof vest's protection, it only grazed his skin a little. Jim was already pinned to the ground. Gong Jie walked towards Jim and said, "Do a head count." He walked to Jim's side and stepped on his body with his military boots. Expressionlessly, he snatched the satellite phone from his hand and hung it up without hesitation. Reporting young Master Jie. We've done a head count. No team members are dead but 2 are injured. Is it serious? It's not serious. Gong Jie put on his earpiece and called Vermilion Bird. Soon Vermilion Bird picked up the call. Vermilion Bird, how's the progress? Young Master Jie, we found the 3 hostages safely and are on our way back. Did everything go well? It went well. We didn't lose any team members but a few of my team members and I were injured. Is it serious? It's not fatal. What about you? How's it going? Everything went well. It went so smoothly that it made one's heart palpitate. The whole thing went too smoothly. In fact, it went so smoothly that it was unbelievable. Gong Jie caught a glimpse of Jim, who was pinned to the ground, from the corner of his eye. A sly smile gradually appeared on the latter's face. Instantly, his temples throbbed violently. For some reason, this smile was a little creepy and made one feel uneasy. He grabbed Jim and went straight to the point. You're not Jim. Who are you? What? Young Master Jie, didn't I hear that your subordinates brought the hostages back safely? However, do I need to remind you that your wishful thinking seems to have gone wrong? Sect Master had long expected that you would not obediently fulfill the deal. Who are you? Gong Jie was getting more and more annoyed. Even though the information reported from the other side was that they had safely evacuated with the 3 hostages and were on their way back. However, he had a feeling that things weren't that simple. Jim's smile became even more dazzling. Gong Jie was certain that this man was definitely not Jim. He grabbed him by the collar and asked coldly, "Who the hell are you?" Before Jim could speak, his satellite phone suddenly rang. Gong Jie looked at the satellite phone in his hand and felt a boundless chill seeping into his body. His limbs immediately became incomparably cold and his scalp numbed. Answer it. Why aren't you answering it? Jim urged him on. Gong Jie answered the call. On the other end, a middle-aged man's deep and sinister voice could be heard. Young Master Jie, how have you been? Jim. Was the person on the other end the real Jim? Chapter 44:39. How could the real Jim show up so easily? Your subordinates rushed into my territory and killed several of my followers. May I ask, how should I settle this debt with you? On the other end, the man's voice was filled with displeasure, but his calm tone made people feel even more terrified. Gong Jie frowned. Originally, he thought that since Hua Jin and the others had been brought back safely by the Vermilion Bird, then, in front of Jim, he should naturally have some confidence. However, for some reason hearing Jim say this made his hair stand on end. I hate disobedient children the most. On the other end, the man complained, originally the deal that has already been agreed upon, can't you just obediently fulfill it? Why do you have to play these tricks? I'm really tired of it. What do you want? Jim no longer spoke. However, through the satellite phone, Gong Jie could vaguely hear that Jim was in a very empty square. In the square, the sound of a loudspeaker suddenly came from the square. The war in this world has never stopped, just like the endless night, never seeing the dawn. After today, tomorrow, those soldiers will rush in and slaughter us wantonly. The souls that die in the hands of those soldiers will all become the puppets of those devils. They will tightly grip the throats of our souls. We will no longer have a future. We will no longer have eternal life. Immediately after, through the satellite phone, one could clearly hear the cheers of the believers in the square, as well as the cries of some women and children. All the voices were mixed together, like a sad song before one's death. Let us use our lives as a sacrifice to the great Jesus Christ. He will bless our souls and lead us to paradise. Tonight everyone will die. If you truly love me, then please die with me. Those who survive, the government will not let you go, the armed forces will not let you go, even the hurricane will not let you go. We will fight to the death with those devils, but please forgive me. In the end, I will use all of our souls as a sacrifice to the dawn of this world. The voice clearly came from Jim. His voice was very recognizable, high and powerful. Today we will all die, but tomorrow he will resurrect us. In the next second, the satellite phone was cut off. Gong Jia was already drenched in cold sweat. He immediately put on his headset and contacted Vermilion Bird. The Vermilion Bird quickly picked up the call. What's wrong, young Master Jia? Are you sure you brought the 3 hostages back safely? Gong Jia said, it wasn't the real Jim who showed up. Just now on the satellite phone, I heard all the believers gathered in the square, and Jim seemed to be making a declaration. The Sacred Palace sect has a very large plaza. When I left with the 3 hostages, I saw from afar that there was a very large barrel in the middle of the podium. Bucket? Yes. The Vermilion Bird told him the whole story in a concise and comprehensive manner. The Sacred Shrine sect wasn't big and only had a few thousand followers. However, when they were rescuing the hostages, a male heretic who was guarding the hostages actually begged them to take him away. He knew best how to inflict the most pain on others without causing them to die from excessive blood loss and severe injuries. His subordinates had experienced the cruelest torture in the world. Therefore, he knew how to inflict pain on others without causing them to die. It's okay if you don't say anything. However, I won't kill you right away. Gong Jia's breathing was heavy. He leaned close to the man and forcefully gouged out half of his skin with the defense master in his hand. Chapter 44-41. Gong Jia pulled out his knife and stabbed it into the man's thigh. It was extremely painful, but it was not fatal. Gong Jia questioned sternly, are you going to talk or not? The man's will finally wavered and he began to beg. Just kill me. Just kill me. Don't torture me anymore. I'm warning you, I'm giving you one last chance. Otherwise, I have plenty of ways to torture you until you wish you were dead. Gong Jia gave him another backhand stab and stabbed him in the waist. The man screamed like a pig being slaughtered. It was incomparably mournful. I'll talk. I'll talk. The man trembled all over and said with difficulty, the cult leader is very kind and righteous. He thinks that man has the blood of the Son of God and he wants, what does he want? He wants to use that hostage as a final sacrifice. He has decided to use that Son of God as a sacrifice. Tonight, all the believers will gather in the square and then accept the cult leader's final favor and follow him with their lives. Gong Jia was stunned when he heard this. He suddenly recalled Vermilion Bird's words. The bucket in the square is filled with strawberry juice that has been laced with cyanide. Tonight, Jim will summon all the believers to gather in the square. Everyone will drink the highly toxic strawberry juice and commit mass suicide. Moreover, a living person will be burned as a sacrifice before dawn. Today we will all die, but tomorrow he will resurrect us. Mass suicide, that was insane. Gong Jia questioned, sacrifice? Oh. The man replied, the cult leader plans to tie him to the cross and burn him with fire. What? Everyone looked at each other in disbelief. They could not believe that there was such a crazy thing. Gong Jia was furious. Where is he now? Now he should be taken to the square, right? Where is the square? The man suddenly stopped talking. He did not want to reveal so much information. Are you going to tell me or not? Gong Jia held Defense Master tightly. His gaze was piercingly cold, like a beast waiting to hunt in the dark night. The man was scared half to death and finally confessed everything. I'll take you there. I'll take you there. I beg you, don't torture me anymore. Hearing this, Gong Jia stood up, looked around and ordered, prepare weapons and a car for me. But, young Master Jia, there are battles everywhere. It's too dangerous to go there rashly. Cut the crap. Gong Jia turned around, full of murderous intent. Go and prepare. Yes. Your subordinate will go and prepare now. Long live the Divine Temple. Long live Jim. Long live the Divine Temple. Long live the Saint. Hua Jin was awakened by a group of majestic roars. He opened his eyes in a daze. Before he fully regained consciousness, he saw a huge square in front of him under the moonlight. In the square, a group of believers gathered together. Some were carrying babies while others were supporting each other. He was startled. Just as he opened his mouth, he suddenly saw a man in a black robe carrying a bucket of things and walking in front of him. "What are you doing?" Before he could see clearly what was in the bucket, he saw the man pick it up. Chapter 44-42. Suddenly, a bucket of gasoline was poured over his head. The gasoline drenched his body and instantly corroded his whip wounds. Hua Jin sucked in a breath of cold air and gritted his teeth. He lowered his head, and only then did he clearly see his current situation. He was tied to a cross, and there was a pile of firewood under his feet. On the side, a believer held a torch in his hand. The flame bloomed eerily in the night wind, like a deadly flame flower. Hua Jin suddenly felt his hair stand on end. Were they going to burn him alive as a sacrifice? In the square, hundreds and thousands of believers knelt down devoutly. "Holy Son, please bestow eternal life to our leader, please bestow eternal life to us. Long live His Highness the Holy Son." A group of people knelt down in front of Hua Jin inexplicably. Hua Jin saw that their faces were either filled with joy or tears. Some women were holding babies and kissing their husbands reluctantly. At this moment, a group of people followed a man in a suit onto the stage. It was Jim. Hua Jin had seen him a few times. It was said that he was the leader of the thousands of believers in the square, the great leader of the Sacred Palace sect. Jim stood on the podium, and for the last time he faced all the believers and gave a speech. "Tonight here everyone will die. If you really love me, please be sure to die with me with dignity. In the future the Lord will bless your souls with eternal life. In the bucket in the middle of the podium, there is strawberry juice with hydrogen chloride." Hydrogen chloride? Hua Jin suddenly felt a chill run down his spine. That was highly toxic. Even a small amount of hydrogen chloride was enough to kill. Moreover, death would be quick. Although it would be less painful, but were these people crazy? Were they trying to stage a mass suicide? Hua Jin was puzzled. He knew too little about this world. He did not understand why these crazy people would choose to commit mass suicide when they were living well. "Great leader. Please allow me to make a request, okay?" At this moment, a woman suddenly stood out from the square. She wore a headscarf and walked to Jim with tears streaming down her face. She first knelt down and kowtowed devoutly. Then she drew a cross on her chest. "Sect Master, I have a child." She turned around and immediately a man stood up. He looked like her husband and he was holding a baby in his arms. The baby was no more than 10 months old. The woman's face was full of grief. "Great leader Jim, the children are innocent and holy. They don't need to go through this ceremony. Can he not participate in this ceremony?" "Cut the crap." Jim didn't say anything, but the bodyguard beside him cursed on the spot. "How dare you disobey the sect leader's orders?" The bodyguard immediately jumped off the stage and reached out to snatch the baby from the man's arms. The woman cried and threw herself at them, begging, "Please let this child go. He's innocent. Please, please don't be so cruel, okay? You better do it yourself. Otherwise I'll beat you to death, you bitch. Then choke him to death along with this filthy child." The other believers began to jeer. "Unclean. Dirty. They're insulting the Sacred Palace sect. Sect Master, please kill them. That child is unclean and will bring misfortune to the Sacred Palace sect. Kill them. Kill them." Chapter 44-43. Hua Jin's heart was filled with sorrow. How pitiful were these believers to believe in an evil cult to such an extent that they wouldn't even let off an innocent child. The child was still so young that he didn't even understand what was happening. His pair of helpless eyes kept looking around, frightened by the shrill screams of the people around him. These believers looked so contradictory. They were afraid of death, but they also looked forward to it. It was as if death would really bring them eternal life. It was as if their souls would be purified because of it. What exactly did this damn Sacred Palace sect brainwash them? "You choose." The bodyguard's face was cold. "Do you want to kill this child, or we will behead you honorably?" "I." The poor mother took the child from her husband's arms and looked at the pure and flawless face of the child in her arms. Even if she couldn't bear it, she had to endure the pain and make a decision. I choose to do it myself." "No." Hua Jin suddenly shouted to stop her. Everyone turned to look at him. Under everyone's gaze, Hua Jin was at a loss. He pondered for a while and finally gathered his courage and said seriously, "Everyone, don't listen to the nonsense of this so-called leader. What Sacred Palace sect? He will only bring you misfortune. However, no one understood what he said. They couldn't understand Chinese. The saint has spoken. The believers once again kowtowed devoutly. A sense of powerlessness suddenly engulfed his whole body. Hua Jin could only watch helplessly as the mother let out her last sorrowful wail. Immediately after, she was forced to take a glass of strawberry juice from the bodyguard. Her heart ached, but she forced the child's mouth open and slowly poured the sweet but poisonous strawberry juice into the child's mouth. The poison took effect very quickly. The child cried a few times, then suddenly straightened his legs and stopped moving. His pair of clear eyes immediately darkened. The mother's tears fell like rain. She poisoned her own child with her own hands. My child? Her husband beside her also cried bitterly. There was nothing more painful than killing your own child with your own hands. However, at this moment, under the baptism of the evil cult's teachings, the believers who had long lost their humanity began to cheer. Let us welcome this great moment. As soon as he finished speaking, believers continuously walked up to the podium, picked up the strawberry juice and drank it in one gulp. An old man began to resist. I don't want it. I want to leave this place. I don't want to die. I don't want to drink that. He finally had a mental breakdown. He struggled continuously, pushing aside the crowd in an attempt to escape. However, a believer pushed him to the ground and a few people stepped on him. Another believer brought strawberry juice and forced it down his throat. How could a powerless old man be a match for these crazy believers? He was forced to drink the strawberry juice. He convulsed and fell to the ground. Then he stopped moving. One after another, believers drank the strawberry juice, and more people went up to the stage to receive it. In the blink of an eye, many people in the square had fallen. The night breeze blew gently as if something was wailing mournfully. Hua Jin watched as the believers drank the strawberry juice, but he was powerless to change the situation. Chapter 44:44. Hua Jin did not expect such a thing to happen in this peaceful era. He also did not expect that the world was not as peaceful as he thought it was. He had always lived in a peaceful country. It was hard for him to imagine such cruel things. Now this tragic scene was playing out in front of him. Perhaps it was because the smell of gasoline on his body was too pungent, but he suddenly felt nauseous. Ugh! He wanted to vomit and felt extremely uncomfortable. He struggled for a while, but his hands were tightly bound and he couldn't move. A believer walked over with a torch. At the same time, the believers in the square became more and more enthusiastic. Long live the Son of God. Long live the sacred shrine. Long live Lord Jim. It was like the last carnival before death. Hua Jin did not know if it was the believers' sorrow or the world's sorrow. It was said that these believers became Jim's fans and supported the sacred shrine because they thought the sacred shrine gave them the last pure land. Most of these believers were refugees from warring countries. Some were even civilians from developed countries. Some of them were old people who had experienced world wars. Some of them were people who had experienced the global financial crisis and went bankrupt. The sacred shrine was founded to fight racial discrimination. Jim was enthusiastic about helping the poor, but he was rejected by some stubborn conservatives in the church. Therefore, Jim decided to build his own church, a sacred church that was truly free and equal. A church that even black people could enter. In the beginning, racial discrimination became more and more severe. Many black people worshipped him as Jesus Christ. He went door to door to collect donations and sold small animals. Finally, he raised enough money to build the church. They set up free cafeterias, day-care centers, clinics for the elderly and other social services. However, later on, the sacred shrine became more and more different from traditional Christianity. Its teachings were gradually distorted. Later, Jim moved the core believers to Siena in East Africa. He promised the believers that it would be a tropical paradise without the evil of the outside world. Most of the core believers followed him to Siena. They were forced to work according to Jim's instructions. Everyone worked together to build the sacred shrine. All the believers lived in the sacred shrine isolated from the outside world. They were extremely poor. They had no private property, no personal life, and no space for thoughts. They were closely monitored by Jim's armed guards. Any believer who tried to ask for personal freedom, such as sex without Jim's permission, would be severely punished. If a believer was found to have apostasy, they would be tortured or even deprived of their life. They did not even know that the outside world was not the end of the world they imagined. Jim, on the other hand, lived a life without restrictions. He owned the fruits of the believer's labor. He lived in a luxurious room with all the modern facilities. He could have sex with any male or female believer. The believers were required unlimited worship, loyalty, and absolute obedience to Jim. Chapter 44-45. A pitiful person must have a detestable side. Ignorance was also a sin. Hua Jin's heart gradually sank into despair. He thought that Alice and Natalia should have been rescued. What he was about to face was probably death. At this moment he suddenly envied those believers. After drinking the strawberry juice that contained hydrogen chloride, they died without much pain. What he was about to face was a raging fire. In the square, some people obediently drank the strawberry juice, while others resisted. However, in the end, those who resisted were shot to death, strangled to death, or injected with cyanide. Jim sat on the throne, trembling as he took out a pistol from the hidden lining of his suit and calmly loaded it. However, when he pressed the muzzle to his temple, his emotions suddenly became agitated. "I will be immortal for all eternity. Everyone must follow me." He suddenly shouted, "Mother! Mother! Burn the holy sun! Burn the holy sun!" The screams became fiercer and fiercer. Hua Jin looked at the people holding torches getting closer and closer. His whole body trembled as he closed his eyes. However, in the next second, the roar of a car came from the end of the square. Immediately after, when the believer raised his hand and was about to throw the torch to the firewood at Hua Jin's feet, two thunderous gunshots echoed. One gunshot was Jim's suicide by swallowing a bullet. The other shot was fired from the end of the square. The bullet accurately pierced the believer's wrist. The torch fell to the ground and ignited the oil barrel at his feet. The fire immediately spread. The believer's body was instantly on fire. He screamed and panicked as he rushed to the crowd in the square. "Ah, go away. This is the fire of sin. Go away." The square instantly went out of control. Hua Jin looked at this scene in a daze. He looked in the direction of the gunshots and saw an off-road vehicle breaking through the encirclement of the believers and speeding toward him. A soldier mounted a light machine gun on the sunroof of the car and fired at the armed forces that were swarming toward them. The car stopped below the stage. Gong Jie pushed open the car door and got out. With a single stride, he effortlessly stepped onto the stage and walked toward Hua Jin. At this moment, Hua Jin was already shocked speechless. "Gong Jie, how are you?" When Gong Jie saw the whip wounds all over his body, his eyes were burning with anger. "Damn it! What did these people do to him? Did they use private punishment? What are you doing here? It's too dangerous here. If I didn't come, you would have died." But what? Shut up." Gong Jie had a murderous look on his face. His murderous aura was so strong that Hua Jin didn't dare to speak for a while. Gong Jie had just untied the ropes around his arms when Hua Jin caught sight of a believer walking toward Jim from the corner of his eye. At this moment, Jim had already fallen on his cult leader's throne and shot himself. Only his cold body was left. The believer took the gun from Jim's hand and reloaded it. Then he aimed it in the direction of Hua Jin and Gong Jie. Beneath their feet was firewood soaked in gasoline. Once the bullet hit the firewood, it would explode violently. Danger. The moment the believer opened fire, Hua Jin suddenly pushed Gong Jie to the side. Chapter 44-46. Gong Jie climbed up nimbly, grabbed Hua Jin's collar and jumped off the stage. Hua Jin's skills were not as good as his. He stumbled all the way until he was thrown into the car. Gong Jie also got into the car. The machine gunner, who was standing at the sunroof, swiftly loaded his gun. Amidst the hail of bullets, he was shot in the shoulder. "Young Master Jie, I've been shot. We have to get out of here as soon as possible." Gong Jie stepped on the accelerator, and the car suddenly sped forward. The believers who had surrounded them were scared into retreating. The light machine gun had a total of 100 bullets, and it had been firing all the way. At this time, there was no way to control whether the bullets were aimed at the armed forces or civilians. At this time, anyone who pounced on the car was identified as a militant by the machine gunner and shot dead one by one. It was especially at this time that they could not compromise with so-called kindness. In a moment's time they could be the ones to die here. Gong Jie drove the car, charging straight ahead. He tried his best to find an empty road with no one around. However, someone shouted from outside the car, and those crazy believers persevered and pounced on the car. It was obvious that they wanted to use their bodies of flesh and blood to block their way. Hua Jin shrank into the corner of the car. There were many militants outside the car and they were all armed. He could not help Gong Jie much and he could only try his best to protect himself and avoid unnecessary harm. During this time, Hua Jin vaguely felt that the car had run over something. A corpse. Or a living person who had been rolled under the wheels. He covered his face in shock, not daring to think too much. Da. The machine gunner was still defending his last position. All of a sudden, Hua Jin felt a warm liquid splashing on his face. He looked up and saw that one of the machine gunner's arms had been injured by a bullet. Blood was gushing out endlessly. "You're injured." However, the machine gunner could not hear him. He had followed Gong Jie to rescue Hua Jin. He already knew that following Gong Jie this time would not bode well for him. On the way here, one of his brothers had died in the smoke. He had never thought of leaving alive. He only wanted to use his body of flesh and blood and his astonishing willpower to escort Gong Jie and Hua Jin out of this place. This was his mission. The car left the square without a hitch and soon left the believers far behind. However, Gong Jie still did not dare to let down his guard. "Leo, how are you?" He looked straight ahead, held the steering wheel and asked the machine gunner. However, there was no response for a long time. Hua Jin carefully patted the machine gunner's waist, but there was no movement for a long time. An ominous premonition arose in his heart. "Is it important? Are you okay?" He carefully carried Leo back to his seat. Only then did he realize that Leo's throat had been injured by a bullet and was badly mutilated. Blood gushed out, but he still maintained the posture of hugging the machine gun. His eyes were opened in a daze and his whole body was trembling. With his throat injured, he could no longer speak. Even if the environment was not so harsh, Hua Jin knew that the machine gunner named Leo was probably dead. "What should we do?" "Gong Jie, he's seriously injured." Gong Jie held the steering wheel tightly. His bloodshot eyes looked at Leo through the rearview mirror. Chapter 44-47. Bang! A loud sound was heard. Gong Jie fired. In an instant, the bullet hit the oil stain on the bottom of the car. In an instant, flames spread all the way and surrounded the oil cylinder. The car exploded and flipped over. "Let's go. We can't stay here for long. If the explosion alarms the nearby army, it won't be good if they rush over." Hua Jin said, "How do we go?" "Where are we going?" "To the port. Most of the troops are waiting there. But first, let's find a place and let them send troops to pick us up." "Okay." Hua Jin followed Gong Jie. He knew in his heart that most of East Africa had fallen into the smoke of war. Originally, it was only a small-scale battle. However, it had evolved to a larger and larger scale. The car rampaged all the way. Along the way, Hua Jin watched the car pass through the rain of bullets. It was hard to imagine that if they were a step later, they would be completely surrounded by the armed forces. At that time, the consequences would be unimaginable. What he didn't expect the most was, originally he had completely given up in his heart. However, he didn't expect that Gong Jie would take such a big risk to rush over to rescue him. Was he not afraid of death? Knowing that the whole of East Africa was covered in the flames of war, he dared to drive a jeep into the divine temple. This time, thank you, Hua Jin still had lingering fear. He didn't hide his gratitude at all. Gong Jie turned around and glanced at him. "What are you thanking me for?" "Thank you for rushing over to save me." "Humph." Gong Jie became arrogant. "Do you think I rushed over here to save you?" "What else? If it wasn't for sister repeatedly asking me to take care of you, I wouldn't have bothered." The grateful smile on Hua Jin's face gradually disappeared. This Gong Jie. He even said that he was touched. He was touched for a long time. He didn't expect that it was because of this reason. Besides, what are you thanking me for? If it wasn't for the grudge between Hurricane and the Divine Temple, you wouldn't have been implicated. Grudge? How could the Divine Temple have a grudge with Hurricane? Hua Jin took a few steps forward. What's going on? Surprisingly, Gong Jie was patient enough to tell him everything in detail. The Sacred Palace sect is at their wits' end. Originally, he had fled to East Africa to find a paradise that was conducive to the development of the church. He did not expect that a war would break out. Without enough food and armaments, they were like trapped beasts in East Africa. That's why he's doing everything he can to kidnap Hurricane as a hostage. He wants to use this hostage to threaten Hurricane. Ah, Hua Jin muttered to himself, why does Hurricane make enemies wherever he goes? Gong Jie turned around. What did you say? No, nothing. In that case, he was the one who was implicated? The thought of Professor Romanka's tragic death made him even more fearful. Do people really have a destiny? Among the four of them, only Professor Romanka did not escape the disaster. Romanka is dead. He was beheaded by those disciples. I know. Do you know? Yes, the Divine Temple sect sent a beheading video a few days ago to provoke Hurricane. Hua Jin didn't know that the game between Hurricane and the Divine Temple sect was so dangerous. Chapter 44-48. We are about 40 kilometers away from the port. If we walk, we might not be able to get there in one night. We have to get back to the port before dawn tomorrow. If his men did not come to their rescue in time, then they might be trapped in such a chaotic place. What worried him even more was that there seemed to be no news from Vermilion Bird. In the last call he seemed to have heard the sound of an explosion. Gong Jie suspected that Jim had replaced Hua Jin with another suicide bomber, pretending to be a hostage. In fact, he had enough explosives tied to his body. He did not know how Vermilion Bird, Natalia and Alice were doing. He had already dispatched dozens of mercenaries to search for them according to the location of the last call. So far there was no feedback. However, Gong Jie was not worried about Vermilion Bird and the others. His most important goal now was to get Hua Jin out of here safely. However, these 40 kilometers on foot was nothing for him. Normally, 40 kilometers was just one of his training subjects. But for Hua Jin, although 40 kilometers was really long, under the control of the desire to survive, it could always stimulate his infinite potential. In order to survive, 40 kilometers was nothing at all. The scary thing was that he did not know what he would encounter on this 40 kilometers road. Put this on. Gong Jie handed him a bulletproof vest. Hua Jin took it but did not expect the bulletproof vest to be far heavier than he imagined. Why is it so heavy? Because it is a bulletproof vest. Is it? Hua Jin said, I have seen bulletproof vests before, but they are not this heavy. Hua Jin put on the bulletproof vest and muttered, this is like making me walk 40 kilometers with this weight. It's killing me. Of course, a normal bulletproof vest is not this heavy. Why? Because Gong Jie walked in front of him, stretched out his hand, pulled out a straw from the vest and opened the valve. There is a filtration device in here and there is some water in it. If they ran out of water, as long as there was a water source, they could replenish themselves. When the water was pumped inside, it would go through a circulation device and be converted into a standard that could be consumed by the human body. In addition, this is a special grade bulletproof vest. Apart from heavy sniper bullets, it can withstand bullets of many types and ranges. As he spoke, he put the bulletproof helmet on the man's head again. Hua Jin felt that this helmet was many times heavier than the heavy headwear on set. I feel like my whole body is heavy. He happened to be thirsty. Hua Jin took out a straw and greedily drank a few mouthfuls. Although it was filtered, the filtered water still had an inexplicable fishy smell. He frowned. Although it tasted bad, he still drank a few mouthfuls. He was too thirsty. It had been a few days since he drank such a refreshing mouthful of water. His lips were already extremely dry and cracked. Gong Jie looked at him and felt an inexplicable heartache. Oh, I think I drank so much and there's not much left in there. There's no rush. I still have some in my clothes. Is this water enough for us to walk more than 40 kilometers? I don't know if there is any river in front. If there is, it won't be a problem to replenish it. The important thing is, gulp. Chapter 44-49. Before he could finish his sentence, Gong Jie heard a wailing sound coming from Hua Jin's stomach. He looked at Hua Jin and the latter suddenly became embarrassed. This? Hungry? Yes. You haven't eaten well these few days, right? Yes. Here. Gong Jie took out a bag of dry food from his backpack. Hua Jin took it but he was a little hesitant. What about you? Do you still have dry food? No more. This is compressed dry food. It should be able to replenish as much energy as possible. Then if I eat it, what about you? Gong Jie played it down. We'll take it one step at a time. I can hold on for a while, but if you can't hold on, I'll carry you and both of us will be finished. As he said that, he added, let's see if we can hunt some living creatures at night. Living creatures? Yes, for example, wild rabbits and wild deer. Roast them. Oh, you know how to hunt? Yes, this is the basic survival skill of the wild. Hua Jin followed Gong Jie's footsteps. He quietly ate the dry food but his heart felt warm. Although Gong Jie didn't seem to be a very meticulous person, the more dangerous the situation was, the more his concern was the greatest encouragement and comfort to Hua Jin. At the same time, there was an indescribable sense of security. Although he was in a predicament with his brother around, he had a feeling that no matter how great the danger was, it was nothing compared to his brother's presence. At night, Gong Jie found a mountain with a natural cave. The weather at night gradually turned cold. The wind was strong and the cave was very warm. Hua Jin carried some firewood. Gong Jie used the flint that he carried with him to light the firewood and started a fire. Stay here and warm yourself. Don't walk around. I'll be back soon. Where are you going? Gong Jie said, to find something to eat. After saying that, he left the cave. Hua Jin obediently guarded the fire. Wrapped in his military coat, he gradually fell asleep. She woke up in a daze, but to her surprise, Gong Jie had already returned. At the same time he smelled blood. Hua Jin curiously stood up and walked over, but Gong Jie heard his movements. He's awake? Yes. Hua Jin walked to his side and saw that he had caught a small deer. Where did this deer come from? Gong Jie said, this deer broke away from the herd. I saw her at the bottom of a hill. She seemed to have broken her leg. Ah, so pitiful. Well, if it wasn't for me it might have been eaten clean by the wolves. When Hua Jin heard this he didn't know whether to laugh or cry. Even if you brought it back, wouldn't it be eaten clean by you? Being eaten by me is better than being eaten by wild wolves. Wild wolves might leave behind bones. If it was eaten by you, it might not even have a complete corpse. Gong Jie looked at him unhappily. You seem to like arguing with me? Oh, I'm bored anyway. Hua Jin sat down beside him. Watching him skinning the deer skillfully, he couldn't help but complain, if I didn't know better, I would have thought that you were a butcher. Get lost. Don't be so fierce. Hua Jin felt wronged. So boring. How can I relieve my boredom if I don't talk? You have the strength to talk. Gong Jie snorted. I'm exhausted, so don't bother me. Chapter 4450. Venison was a delicacy in the world. Even without seasoning, the fresh and tender meat made him yearn for it. He gave the only dry food he had on him to Hua Jin. He was so hungry that his stomach was rumbling and he still had to peel off the deer's skin. God knew that he was almost drooling when he looked at the venison. Fortunately his luck was good. Not long after leaving the cave, he heard a deer crying at the bottom of the hill. It was relatively smooth. 20 minutes later, Gong Jie put the venison on the fire and handcuffed it happily. Zili, the meat was on fire and made a beautiful sound. Gulp! Gong Jie licked his lips and his eyes widened. Hua Jin looked at the venison skewers on the rack, constantly rotating and handcuffing them evenly. He actually started to crave for it. However, I heard that eating barbecue can easily cause cancer. Hua Jin suddenly came up with a philosophy of health. Gong Jie glanced at him meaningfully. You don't have to eat it. No, I want to eat it. Didn't you say that barbecue can cause cancer? It will be fatal if you don't eat it. Hua Jin spat out another golden sentence. Gong Jie couldn't help but be amused by him. At such a critical moment this clown could actually make him laugh. However, this venison looks very small. Even if 2 people eat it, they shouldn't be able to finish it. Don't worry, I'm so hungry now that I can swallow a cow. Hua Jin said silently. Usually people who say that seem to be too hungry, but if they really eat it, their combat strength is not good. Gong Jie glanced at him coldly. Was this guy a bar spirit? Why was he always arguing with him? Don't worry, my combat strength is stronger than yours. In short, when the time comes, the meat will be evenly divided into 2 portions. You eat 1 portion and I'll eat the other. Okay, I want the leg and breast of the deer. What about me? The butt of the deer. Hua Jin, on purpose, he must be doing it on purpose. Gong Jie gestured with his eyes. Look at the butt of this deer. It looks very fat and tender. I don't want to eat the butt of the deer. If you don't want to eat it, then don't eat it. On what basis? Based on, this deer was brought back by me. Hua Jin was not convinced. You obviously stole it. What do you mean by steal? Isn't it considered stealing? You weren't the one who caught him. If you spout any more nonsense, I'll skin you and roast you. Iske, how could Hua Jin be threatened by him? He rolled his eyes. Perhaps even he did not realize that he dared to roll his eyes at Gong Jie. Gong Jie pursed his lips and smiled, but he did not say anything. Instead, he continued to handcuff the venison leisurely. His technique was extremely skillful and the handcuffs were very even. Hua Jin yawned. Half an hour later, the venison was finally cooked. Gong Jie took the venison and cut it into pieces with a dagger. Hua Jin picked up a piece and put it in his mouth. He tasted it. Oh, it's so light but so tender. There's no seasoning, so of course it's light. Sigh, what a pity. If I sprinkled some cumin, it would be a delicacy in the world. At this juncture he could not care so much. As long as he could fill his stomach, it was fine. Hua Jin ate with relish. Gong Jie did not really give him the butt of the deer. Instead, he shared the meat of the deer's leg and chest with him. Gong Jie was really hungry. When he ate, he was not as elegant as Hua Jin. He directly hugged a deer leg and gnawed on it. Hua Jin was really shocked by his table manners. He silently complained, "The way you eat really looks like the reincarnation of a hungry ghost." Chapter 4451. After finishing off the remaining meat, Gong Jie and Hua Jin were both full. There were still some leftover meat dregs left. Gong Jie threw these into the fire. They had already eaten as much as possible. They couldn't finish the meat. After a night, the meat would also rot. If they continued to leave it, the fragrance would attract some stragglers or other wild beasts. To be safe. When Hua Jin was about to fall asleep, he vaguely felt someone put a jacket on him. He opened his eyes in a daze and saw Gong Jie walking out. Where are you going? Hua Jin asked in a daze. I'm going to get some firewood. You sleep first. Gong Jie's calm tone made him feel inexplicably at ease. Hua Jin couldn't care less about sleepiness. He hadn't slept well for several days. Therefore, as soon as he closed his eyes, he fell asleep as if he had fainted. When Gong Jie came back with the firewood, Hua Jin was already sleeping soundly. He walked over and surrounded the fire with firewood. Then he lay down beside Hua Jin. With a thud, Hua Jin's body tilted and his head rested on Gong Jie's shoulder. Gong Jie turned to look at him. His face was right in front of her. Even when he was asleep, he was very quiet and could even be said to be well behaved. A peaceful sleeping face just like a little puppy. He actually described him as a little puppy. If Hua Jin was awake and could hear his inner thoughts, he would be so angry that he would bare his fangs and brandish his claws at him. It was unbelievable. Gong Jie breathed a sigh of relief. He never thought that he would risk his life for someone other than Yun Shishir. When he found out that Hua Jin had been kidnapped, he was almost instinctively anxious. Even before this incident, Gong Jie didn't know that this guy had already occupied such a deep-rooted position in his heart. This was probably the most impulsive thing he had ever done in his entire life. He had staked everything on a single throw, putting himself in such a dangerous situation without considering the consequences. However, the moment he saw Hua Jin, all the anxious voices in his heart and mind calmed down. Gong Jie exhaled deeply and closed his eyes. The two of them snuggled up to each other and fell asleep. Outside the cave, the wind was biting cold. From time to time, wild wolves smelled the fragrance of the venison and came over. However, it was fearful of the blazing flames. It shrank back and let out an unwilling howl. Unknowingly, it was already dawn. In a daze, Hua Jin was awakened once by the wolf's howl at dawn. When he opened his eyes, he felt something heavy on his thigh. He lowered his head and saw that Gong Jie had fallen asleep on top of him. No wonder. In his dream, he dreamt that he was lifting weights and his thighs were extremely heavy. It turned out that this fellow was sleeping on his lap. Could be seen that he was really tired. Before seeing him on the ship, Gong Jie didn't really have a good rest. It was even difficult for him to close his eyes. He slept briefly once but was woken up by a nightmare. He dreamed that Hua Jin and Alice were also beheaded, and only Natalia was saved. After waking up from the dream, he felt uneasy and didn't dare to sleep anymore. He was afraid that if he slept, the nightmare would come true. At dawn, the wolves were howling but he didn't wake up. Chapter 44:52. He lowered his head to look at the man. Even though he was in such a sorry state, it couldn't hide his high spirits. He was a clean freak. Not showering for 2 days was probably his limit. What made it hard for him to calm down was, it seemed that no one had ever fought so hard for him before. He had thought that Gong Jie would definitely give up on him. After all, the fighting around them was escalating. East Africa was completely engulfed in the whirlpool of war. If Gong Jie had come alone to save him, he might have been buried with him. But he still came. It wasn't that she wasn't touched. Although the fuse of this incident was the dispute between the Hurricane Group and the Sacred Palace sect, he was also a victim, a fish in the moat that was implicated. But Gong Jie didn't have to save him. But he still came. This proud man had ended up in such a sorry state in order to save him. He was extremely shocked. Hua Jin carefully adjusted his position and protected Gong Jie's head. He closed his eyes and slept for a while. A vermilion bird brought Alice and Natalia to the port. The car exploded. Although they had jumped out of the car in time, Alice was slightly injured because she was protecting Natalia. And because of the explosion at close range, Vermilion Bird's eardrum was perforated and bleeding. Luckily, Alice checked and found that it wasn't a big deal. The perforated eardrum wasn't serious. With proper treatment, it wouldn't affect her hearing. Vermilion Bird was proud of her eagle-like eyesight and excellent hearing. If her hearing was damaged, she would definitely feel depressed. The car was destroyed and the supplies were gone. Luckily, Vermilion Bird still had some equipment on her. She hijacked a car halfway, passed through the rain of bullets, crossed the battlefield and finally reached the port. Vermilion Bird got out of the car and boarded the ship with Natalia and Alice. However, she didn't see Gong Jie and Hua Jin. "Where's young Master Jie? He hasn't returned." "He hasn't returned?" "Yeah, he went to save another hostage." There's still no news? No, he successfully rescued the hostages, but Renaud and Ben were sacrificed. Renaud, Vermilion Bird frowned when she heard this. Alice's heart sank when she heard this. Alice said, Renaud will be officially retiring soon. How could this happen? It's not hard to imagine. Red Sparrow said solemnly, now many areas in East Africa have fallen. Renaud and Ben fought their way in and out. They must have suffered heavy losses. I heard that something happened last night. The people of the Divine Palace sect killed themselves. What? Vermilion Bird and Alice turned pale with fright. How could this be? Then, Natalia asked worriedly, where are the two of them? Have you left safely? According to the information I have, young Master Jia and Hua Jin have already left safely and are less than 40 kilometers away from the harbor. They are trying their best to get here. The war zone has fallen. Those martial artists threaten to blow up the port. If we don't leave now, we'll be in grave danger. We can't leave, Alice said firmly. Gong Jia and Hua Jin aren't here yet. We can't leave. Of course we can't leave. Chapter 44:53. Vermilion Bird added, even if the port is bombed, we can't leave. If there's no other way, make an exception and let the headquarters send reinforcements. Under normal circumstances, Hurricane would never interfere with the internal affairs of other countries. Especially under such circumstances. Vermilion Bird said, send me a few men. I'll bring them to find Gong Jia and the others. No. Alice was the first to object. You're seriously injured and your hearing is damaged. You won't be able to recover in a short period of time. If you bring people over now, you'll be courting death. Then what should we do? Vermilion Bird spread her arms, her face red with anxiety. Do you want us to wait here and do nothing? So what if I'm injured? I can even give up my life to protect young Master Jia. Don't add to the unnecessary losses, Alice said firmly. Didn't they say that they have sent people to rescue them? For lucky young Master Jia might be back soon. 40 kilometers isn't far. It's not far. Vermilion Bird suddenly became agitated. But do you know that all the main roads and transportation fortresses in East Africa have been bombed? The only places we can pass through are the forests and deserts. What does this mean? We'll have to search the mountains and the plains to find two people. It's like looking for a needle in a haystack. Since you know it's like looking for a needle in a haystack, Alice took a deep breath. Then don't be impatient. Don't act rashly. Act rashly. Vermilion Bird was agitated. Aren't you worried about young Master Jia? Alice's eyes flickered slightly. Vermilion Bird said, now that young Master Jia is in deep danger, you can still speak so casually about not acting rashly. Will it work if you go? Alice exhaled. On the contrary, I'm more worried about Gong Jia than you are. But if you go there like this, will it definitely work? Why don't you wait a little longer? It won't be too late for you to go if there's really no news. Vermilion Bird bit her lip, her gaze cold. Officer Vermilion Bird listened to Alice. Don't be so agitated. Young Master Jia also has the ability to protect himself. He also has outstanding experience. In a place like this, he definitely knows how to protect himself. Vermilion Bird was extremely angry. She walked to the railing and ruthlessly punched the railing. The sound of flesh hitting flesh was so clear. Vermilion Bird, I understand your feelings. Alice walked to her side with a complicated expression and gently patted her shoulder. I'm worried about Gong Jia just like you. But look at how dangerous it was on our way here. You've lost so much of your stamina and you're injured. If you go over, it'll be a meaningless sacrifice. Why don't you let someone else go? Besides, I've already said that I've already sent people to look for Gong Jia and Hua Jin. Don't worry. The Vermilion Bird lowered its head and closed its eyes but did not speak. The bloodstains on her golden hair had already dried up. Together with her sweat, they stuck to her cheeks, making her look incomparably miserable. After a long while, she said gloomily, got it? So thirsty? Hua Jin followed behind Gong Jia without stopping for a moment. Besides the heat, there was also the physical exhaustion from the long journey. The water in his body was evaporating at an accelerated rate, and he wanted to drink water. However, the water stored in his bulletproof vest had already been emptied. Chapter 44:54. Come here. Hua Jin walked over in a daze. What are you doing? Gong Jia opened his bulletproof vest. Drink. That was because the bulletproof vest was worn on his body, and it was usually worn on his chest. If he was wearing the vest, he would be able to drink the water with a straw. The point was, this man was really F*** king tall. There was a difference of 10 centimeters and he was right at his chest. drinking water and lying on his chest. It looked like he was drinking milk. However, he was really thirsty. Hua Jin asked politely, "Aren't you thirsty?" "Yes." "Then, why don't you drink some first?" Gong Jie raised an eyebrow but did not refuse. He took the straw and took a big gulp. Hua Jin looked at him anxiously. He felt that he was going to drain all the water in the bulletproof vest. "Leave some for me." Hua Jin was anxious. "I feel like I'm dying of thirst." Gong Jie passed the straw to him. Hua Jin walked over and tiptoed slightly. Just as he was about to suck on the straw, he suddenly remembered that Gong Jie had just drunk some water. The straw was stained with his. Was this considered kissing in disguise? Bah! Why did he think so much? Hua Jin closed his eyes and drank contentedly. After a few sips, the straw could not draw any more water. This guy, he wanted to drain all the water in one gulp. However, this gulp had somewhat alleviated the crisis. Hua Jin finally regained some energy. He looked around at the dense forest and felt a little hopeless. "Is there a water source nearby? I'm looking for it." "Oh." Hua Jin muttered, "I don't have a map. I'm like a headless fly." Gong Jie suddenly stepped on the soil on the ground. "Do you see the soil? Moist soil, ants and earthworms. This means that there's a water source not far from here." "Oh, that's amazing." Gong Jie continued, "However, in some areas with high mineral content, perhaps the heavy metal content is too high. Drinking it directly is definitely not good for the body. Therefore, although this kind of water can be drunk directly, it must be precipitated and purified before drinking it." So, when you see a water source, draw the water into your bulletproof vest to purify it first. Don't drink it in a hurry or you'll die. If you drink too much, you'll have diarrhea and become dehydrated. When it came to surviving in the wild, the worst thing was diarrhea, which would increase the loss of water content. The two of them walked one after the other. Sure enough, not long after, Hua Jin vaguely heard the sound of trickling water. "I hear the sound of water." Hua Jin said excitedly, "There should be water nearby." "Yes." Hua Jin followed the direction of the sound of the water and walked in front. Gong Jie couldn't help but stop him. "Slow down. What if you fall?" Only then did Hua Jin slow down. After walking for a few dozen meters, they finally saw a small stream. Gong Jie walked down and first checked the water quality. It was actually drinkable. He cupped the stream water and took a sip. It was slightly sweet. "Wow. It's delicious." It was even better than mineral water. Hua Jin directly buried his head in the water, opened his mouth wide and drank to his heart's content. Gong Jie drank more elegantly. He cupped the water and drank it sip by sip. Even if he was at the end of his rope, he still maintained his elegant posture. Chapter 44-55. Hua Jin imitated his actions. He took out the water pipe and slowly pumped out the water. As more and more water was pumped out, Hua Jin gradually felt that the bulletproof vest was getting heavier and heavier. "Wow. It's so heavy." Gong Jie said, "Later, be careful when you walk. Don't step on the trap." Along the way, Gong Jie found a few traps used to hunt rabbits and deer. They were probably set up here by the locals. However, this kind of trap was the most old-fashioned kind. Generally, the more advanced traps would catch the prey without causing too much damage. In this way, most of the prey caught would be alive and the meat would be fresh and tender. However, this kind of old-fashioned trap would have infinite strength once it caught something. It was extremely difficult to break free. The prey would die from excessive blood loss. When that happened, the blood would coagulate, and the freshness of the meat would be affected. Got it? Hua Jin filled the bulletproof vest with water and screwed on the valve. After replenishing their supplies, the two of them continued on their journey. They carefully passed through the forest. There was a boundless plain without any shelter. Gong Jie became more and more nervous and cautious. According to experience, such a plain was a shortcut to the war zone. The combatants would use transport vehicles to continuously transport soldiers to the war zone. Therefore, someone would fill this place with landmines. Once the vehicle crossed the line and detonated the landmines, it would immediately flip the vehicle upside down. The landmines were not powerful, but it was enough to blow people up. Gong Jie said, "When you walk, look under your feet. If the soil under your feet is sparse, it means that there may be landmines buried. Try to stay as far away as possible." When Hua Jin heard this, he suddenly became nervous. "There's such a thing?" "Yes." Gong Jie pointed at a layer of overturned soil not far away and walked over. "Do you see this pit?" Hua Jin walked over and saw Gong Jie pulling out a fuse from the pit. "This is a landmine that has been detonated. There are some bloodstains on the side. It seems that it has been stepped on. It's too scary." Hua Jin was still scared. I don't dare to walk. Gong Jie said, follow behind me. All right. Hua Jin stuck closely behind Gong Jie. Gong Jie said, do you have to stick so close? Didn't you tell me to stay close? But you don't have to stick to me, do you? Ah, Hua Jin took half a step back. Anyway, be careful. Gong Jie held the Fama's rifle and looked through the 4x scope, but he didn't see anyone crouching. They weren't wearing government or anti-government uniforms. No matter which side they encountered, it was extremely dangerous. It was fine that the war hadn't completely broken out. Once it fully erupts, it doesn't matter if you're an armed person or a civilian, as long as you're not in the same team, you'll be shot to death. Give me a weapon too. Gong Jie turned around and was a little surprised. You know how to shoot? I've acted in war dramas before, so the crew organized systematic drills. Gong Jie casually handed over a Desert Eagle to him. Hua Jin fumbled around, loaded it and then pulled the trigger. But he didn't expect the trigger to be lighter than he imagined. Gong Jie immediately turned around and aimed his gun at the empty space beside him. Chapter 44:56. The dirt and dust that was stirred up made the two of them covered in dust. Gong Jie's eyes were about to spit fire. If he had been a little slower, the bullet would have pierced his abdomen. Are you crazy? Why are you shooting at me? Hua Jin's face was red with embarrassment. I didn't expect the trigger to be so light. I almost died in your hands. Gong Jie was still in shock and stared at him. Put the safety on. Oh. Angrily, Hua Jin put the safety on the gun and carefully guarded it. Gong Jie frowned. Don't touch it unless it's a critical moment. I know. I'm sorry. Hua Jin muttered with a distressed expression. He was scared to death just now and felt that he was holding him back. He thought that if he was not a burden, Gong Jie would not have such a hard time leaving. His stamina was really lagging behind. Even so, Hua Jin gritted his teeth and followed Gong Jie closely. After walking for some time, Gong Jie raised his hand and looked at his watch. The watch was equipped with a smart GPS system. They were about 30 kilometers away from the port. Bad luck. There were no cars on the road. If there was one with wheels, it would reduce the burden of the journey. So tired, the two of them had already traveled 10 kilometers. Along the way, Hua Jin could not bear to drink water. The skin on his lips had peeled off a few layers. Gong Jie sat down and touched his stomach. He was hungry after such a long time of physical exhaustion. However, he did not have any dry food with him. He could only take out a straw and drink some water. After resting for a while, they continued their journey. Hua Jin walked unsteadily. The scorching sun was on top of his head. His face was red from the heat. If it was in the past, he would have screamed and yelled. His skin was famous for being allergic. He would get sunburned easily after being exposed to the sun for a long time. But now, even dry food was a problem, let alone protection from the sun. He really wished that he was a solar engine that could convert the sun into his body's power. Hua Jin stumbled and suddenly stepped on a piece of soft soil. Beep! Gong Jie, who was walking in front, suddenly turned his head. Before his brain could issue an order, his body had already reacted under the condition of reflex and rushed towards Hua Jin. In an instant, the landmine buried under the soil exploded. Bong! The power of the landmine sent the two of them flying a few meters away. Gong Jie hugged Hua Jin tightly, and the two of them rolled far away. Until the two of them stopped. Gong Jie sat up and shook his head violently. He looked at Hua Jin, who was frowning in his arms, and gently patted his face, only to see that his ears were bleeding. His eardrums were slightly damaged because of the explosion. Gong Jie's ears were also slightly blind. However, he sat on the ground and felt a slight tremor. His many years of combat experience told him that a car was coming. He immediately put Hua Jin down, picked up his rifle, and looked in the direction of the sound, eyeing it covetously. Through his scope, he saw an off-road vehicle driving over shakily. Gong Jie narrowed his eyes, aimed at the windshield and fired 2 shots. The accurate bullets instantly pierced through the glass. The shattered glass caught the 2 people in the car off guard. Chapter 44:57. Just as he touched the landmine on his waist, he hesitated and retracted his hand. No, I can't blow up the car. Gong Jie stood up and dragged Hua Jin to a tree. Using the tree as cover, he aimed at the car. Da-da-da! Hua Jin vaguely heard the sound of gunshots. He struggled to get up, but before he could see what was going on, Gong Jie shielded him with one hand. Don't move. He turned to look at Gong Jie, only to see the latter skillfully reloading his gun with one hand and shooting in a certain direction. Hua Jin took out the binoculars on his bulletproof vest and saw a car parked not far away. Two men in plain clothes with guns were shooting in Gong Jie's direction. They had obviously discovered Gong Jie and Hua Jin's hiding place. Bullets kept hitting the tree trunk. Hua Jin could not help but tremble with fear. He carefully hid himself behind the tree. He only had a pistol on him, so he could not help Gong Jie. The only thing he could do was to protect himself. The other party was especially cunning and knew how to use the car as a cover. Gong Jie was reluctant to hit the car. His original intention was to kill the two men and then take their car. After reloading 3 magazines, the gunshots finally stopped. Gong Jie shot the two men and stood up. First, he scanned the surroundings with the scope. When he confirmed that there was no one else, he said to Hua Jin, "I'll go over and take a look. You stay here and watch for me." "No, I'll go with you." Hua Jin stood up. He thought that although he could not help much, he might be able to take a bullet for Gong Jie when necessary. Gong Jie hesitated for a moment and finally nodded. "Stay close." "Okay." Gong Jie and Hua Jin walked to the side of the car. There were 2 men lying on the ground. They had been shot in the shoulder and had lost consciousness. When the powerful bullet pierced their shoulders, it also caused a lot of damage to their brains. Or, at such a time, they could only pretend to be unconscious to escape death. However, Gong Jie would not give them such a chance. On the battlefield, there were too many people who pretended to be corpses and shot people in the back. He did not want to be ambushed for no reason. Gong Jie took out a Colt and fired 2 more shots at the 2 unconscious men on the ground. The 2 men's bodies twitched and their legs straightened. "Get in the car." "Okay." Hua Jin nimbly got into the car. Just as Gong Jie started the engine, he saw through the rearview mirror that someone had suddenly popped out from behind the car. It turned out that there was a person crawling under the car, using the car as cover. Hua Jin watched helplessly from the rearview mirror as the man whipped out a pistol. "Be careful." Hua Jin immediately pressed Gong Jie's head and hid behind the seat. Da-da-da, the bullets hit the central control panel. Gong Jie immediately knew that there was someone behind the car. He lowered his head, started the car, put it in reverse, stepped on the accelerator and ran over the man. "Ah!" The man let out a scream and was knocked to the ground. "Are you okay?" Gong Jie controlled the steering wheel and put the car in gear again. "I'm fine. Why are you bleeding?" Hua Jin touched his neck. When the bullet grazed his neck, he did not feel any pain. It was only when he touched the wound that he felt a burning pain. When the bullet passed by, there was a burning pain. Chapter 44:58. At this time, you still care about whether it leaves a scar or not? Gong Jie's face was full of disappointment. He put the car in gear, stepped on the accelerator, and knocked the man who was struggling to get up to the ground again. The car sped away. Hua Jin looked at the 3 corpses behind him with lingering fear. He was still in shock. "Is there enough gas in the car?" "Not much, but it should be enough to drive for 20 kilometers. "Well, that's good." Hua Jin's heart finally calmed down a little. "You said you can shoot, right?" Gong Jie said and threw the rifle to him. "When I ask you to shoot, aim at the ground and shoot a few bullets. If there were landmines, detonate them in advance." This was the most helpless way to eliminate explosives in an emergency situation. Hua Jin held the gun and was a little hesitant. "Do you have enough bullets?" "Only 100 or 200 bullets." "Then, do you want to save some?" "I don't know if we will encounter enemies in the future, but if we save these bullets, the car will be blown up by the landmines. That's not worth it." "I understand." Hua Jin followed Gong Jie's instructions and used bullets to eliminate the explosives. As Gong Jie expected, along the way Gong Jie could see if the soil was turned over. At his order, Hua Jin fired a few bullets at the area. It worked every time. They really eliminated a few areas with landmines. Leaving the plain area, they unknowingly reached the seaside. Following the seaside road, they could smoothly reach the port. However, the road by the sea was devastated by the explosion. The car struggled to move on the road and the speed had to be reduced to the slowest. Unknowingly, it was already evening. At dusk, the seaside and the horizon became a line. But at this moment, Hua Jin did not dare to let down his guard and enjoy such a beautiful scenery. He was getting closer and closer to the target, but it made him more and more nervous. The wound on his neck was not treated in time. Blood spread to half of his body and dyed his clothes red. Gong Jie looked at it earlier and did not hurt his aorta. This was a blessing in disguise. However, Hua Jin was already riddled with injuries. Previously, he had been whipped and tied up, and there were deep marks on his wrists. In addition to the lack of sufficient supplies along the way, he was already on the verge of collapse and was only supported by his will to survive. Hua Jin hugged his gun, his face pale. Gong Jie said, "Soon. If there are no accidents, we'll be there soon." Hang in there, Hua Jin nodded his head, feeling a little dizzy. His eardrums were already damaged, and the wind was so loud that it almost covered up the sound of Gong Jie. But he knew what Gong Jie was talking about. He was telling him to persevere. At the same time, the people sent by Vermilion Bird were also rushing towards Gong Jie to provide support. The two sides finally managed to rendezvous 5 kilometers away from the port. Vermilion Bird was also in the car. When she saw Gong Jie's car, she got out of the car excitedly. Great. Young Master Jie, are you all right? I'm fine. Gong Jie stopped the car. At this moment, Hua Jin was already slumped in his seat, delirious. He opened the car door and nimbly carried Hua Jin out of the car. At this moment, his body was unbelievably weak and he probably could not walk. Vermilion Bird walked over and said, "Let me do it. I'll carry him into the car." Okay. Vermilion Bird walked over and was about to take Hua Jin from Gong Jie's arms when Hua Jin subconsciously clutched Gong Jie's bulletproof vest. Chapter 44:59. In a daze, he clutched his clothes tightly, unwilling to let go. Vermilion Bird's eyes flickered slightly. For some reason, she felt that Hua Jin's dependence on Gong Jie was unusual. Gong Jie smirked and shielded Hua Jin. He hugged him a little tighter and said to Vermilion Bird, "It's okay. I can carry him." Hua Jin wasn't heavy and to him he wasn't even worth mentioning. Now that he was so badly injured, he was worried that Vermilion Bird would be too rough and hurt him. Vermilion Bird nodded and didn't insist. "Are you okay?" "Yeah, I'm fine. Alice and Natalia have returned safely with some minor injuries." Natalia was obviously shocked. "I'm afraid that this incident has caused some psychological trauma." "Yeah, it's good that you're fine." Gong Jie, who was hugging Hua Jin, came back to his senses and took a look. Vermilion Bird said to him, "We have to leave this place as soon as possible. Young Master Jie, most of the East African nationals have been evacuated. The war is about to start. Let's leave this place as soon as possible." "Yeah." Gong Jie carried Hua Jin into the car. The car arrived at the port smoothly. After boarding the cargo ship, the medical staff swarmed over. On the ship, the medical staff couldn't perform any major surgery. However, after an examination, Hua Jin didn't suffer any serious injuries. Some of the serious whip wounds had been carefully stitched up. As for the rest, other than the damage to his eardrums and temporary hearing loss, there weren't any major problems. It was just that he was too weak. He hadn't eaten clean food or water for several days and nights. There was a certain degree of bacterial infection in his body. Hua Jin had fainted because of exhaustion. Initially, when they were rushing back, Hua Jin had relied on his astonishing willpower to hold on, so he was fine. However, when they arrived at their destination, he was relieved and immediately fainted. However, the wound was infected. On the ship, Hua Jin had a high fever. Fortunately, after an emergency infusion and treatment, although the fever was erratic, it didn't lead to pneumonia. During the 2 days they were on the boat, Gong Jie stayed close to them. Other than Natalia, Hua Jin was the one he was most worried about. It was very strange. This kind of feeling made him somewhat doubtful. Initially, he didn't think much of it, but now that he had calmed down, he felt that it was too risky to rush into the